Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show. The unending death aura emanated. Kayla and the others took out their teleportation scrolls all at the same time. Against level 16 dark magic, Kayla had no hesitation at all. No matter how important the trial mission was, it could not be more important than his life. Only a moron would choose to persist in this situation. Kayla was secretly gloating as he took out his teleportation scroll, for he saw that the guy named Felix was still standing at the cave entrance and had no intention of taking out the teleportation scroll. There was even a reckless smile on his face. Idiot, this is a death sentence. Of course, Kayla was just saying it in his heart. He was not foolish. There was not even time to escape from the death sentence, so how did he still have the mood to remind others? Besides, there wasn't any friendship between them at all, on the contrary, there was some friction. He wouldn't forget that the fellow had tried to drive himself away from the cave a while ago. Apart from Lin Li, only Oren and Mason did not take out their teleportation scrolls among all others. They had too much trust in their teammates. To some extent, this trust had reached a blind level. Perhaps only they knew how perverse their teammate was. Let alone persisting in the death sentence. Even if Lin Li said this stone tastes good, everyone try it, they'd probably pick one up immediately and gnaw at it. Having seen all kinds of perverted behaviors of their teammates, the thought that such a freak would stand foolishly under the death sentence to wait for death never crossed their minds at all. No kidding, this fellow would wait for death foolishly? Might as well say a herbivore dragon existed, it might be more believable. Faced with such an unprecedented dark magic, the group of young mages had different thoughts in their minds. However, Lin Li had no time to care about them. His eyes were fixed on the solar sphere falling from the sky as he slowly raised his right hand to magnify the magical elements within the torrent of elements. Almost immediately after the creation of the elemental channel, the death sentence was free from the shackles of the lich's mental strength. The glow of the solar sphere made a deafening roar in the sky. Under the impact of the overwhelming dark magic element, the skeletal prison was destroyed almost instantaneously. Then. There was no then. Bone fragments flew about outside the cave, and inside the cave, the silence was astonishing. Everyone froze, they stood rooted to the ground with a dazed look on their faces. All of them held the teleportation scrolls in their hands, but none of them could open it. Even Oren and Mason were dumbfounded. They had already seen how perverse their teammate was back in the Alana Guild of Magic, and both of them remembered the clash between Oren and Matthias. The freak had received a burning fireball with his body then. But, after all, that was only a fireball. Compared with the death sentence earlier on, there was more than twice the difference in level. The disparity in power was as that of the ant and the elephant. Mason really wanted to bang the wall with his head. He wanted to grab the freak by his neck and shake him with all his might. Are you really human? I'm not dreaming, am I? Kayla rubbed his eyes in despair, he just couldn't believe what he saw. To make sure he wasn't dreaming, he stretched out his hand and pinched his own thigh. The throb of pain that came from his thigh announced to him that it was all true. Kayla's eyes were glazed. As he looked at the cave entrance, he suddenly felt a little dizzy. All of this was too fake, it was unbelievably fake. The mage from Gerosis still stood casually at the cave entrance, and even the smile on his face remained unchanged. The only difference was that his right hand was raised, and a ring inlaid with a black diamond shone dimly in the early morning sunshine. Kayla swallowed his saliva with difficulty. At present, not to mention Kayla, even Sarsen, who had always been so arrogant, was almost scared out of his wits. His expression showed he was utterly confused, and his eyes were bigger than those of cattle. His open mouth was almost wide enough to stuff an egg in. It was just that Sarsen's thoughts were much more complicated than Kayla's. He was a real level 13 magic shooter. Besides Gryffindor, his magic level was the highest among the mages who participated in this trial. In fact, his goal from the beginning was Gryffindor. In his eyes, among the many trial mages, only the #1 magic genius of Felon was qualified to be his rival. However, The previous scene had thoroughly crushed all his perception. Lin Li was unhurt under the death sentence, and could even make level 16 dark magic disappear. What kind of force was this? Faced with a force beyond the limits of a mortal, Sarsen felt an array of complex emotions: shock, joy, disappointment, and jealousy, as several kinds of emotions surged up suddenly. He was dumbstruck for a moment as he looked at the figure at the cave's entrance. And at this moment, Lin Li did not hesitate to input a trace of mana into the torrent of elements. Directing the death sentence into the elemental channel was just the beginning. The complete release of its power was the real reason why Lin Li had waited so long. No. That's impossible. Just as Lin Li was feeding a trace of mana into the torrent of elements, the hoarse voice of the Lich rang from the sky. Human. How could you possibly have the butcher's ring? Butcher? Lin Li was a little stunned at first. But very soon, he almost encountered the bite of mana due to this word. Bhaskar lived in an age when the High Elves ruled over the world of Amrel. The whole Felon kingdom groaned under the butcher knives of the three High Lords. There was only one person whom Bhaskar was referring to as a butcher, that was Osric, who had hanged 30,000 rebels overnight. High Lord Osric's ring. At the thought of this, even the calm Lin Li couldn't help but be startled. The trace of mana he had fed into the torrent of elements nearly resulted in a bite. It was fortunate that his mental strength was powerful enough. Besides, the trace of mana was too weak. The sign of a bite had just surfaced when it was suppressed by Lin Li with his powerful mental strength. Otherwise, he'd be affected by the bite of mana before he even managed to bombard the death sentence. If news of this were to spread, he'd become a ridiculous joke before everyone else. This slight mistake also reminded Lin Li that there'd be time to study the secrets of the ring, but there was only one chance to wipe out the Lich, and it was now. Lin Li calmed his mind again as he abruptly magnified the mana in the torrent of elements. Boom! Once again, a deafening roar sounded from the death sentence, but, this time, it was aimed at the Lich in the sky. Bhaskar had put up an elemental shield the moment it recognized the origin of the ring. At the same time, it waved the skeleton staff in its hand, and a layer of skeletal shield was firmly erected around it. It knew very well the power of the ring. If possible, it really wanted to flee back to its nest at once. However, this was impossible. The death sentence had been released. Even with Bhaskar's strength of an archmage, it could only rely on a variety of shields to hold out against the former. Unless it reached the legendary level and had the ability to teleport, it would never escape the mental lock of the death sentence. No. As the black solar sphere grew bigger and bigger in sight, Bhaskar let out a scream of despair. Fuck, Kayla almost bit his tongue off when the scream of the Lich came. The look he cast on Lin Li afterwards was as if one of looking at a prehistoric dinosaur. He really wanted to ask, is this fellow still a human? Not to mention he could remain unhurt when confronted with the death sentence. Now he had actually blasted the death sentence back. Fuck, could this biatch be a spy that the undead creatures sent to the Guild of Magic? Sarsen's face was as white as a sheet. After taking a glance at Lin Li, he finally sighed resignedly. He now knew how lucky he was. He had been so foolish back in the cave, getting into conflict with such a person. Thank God, thank Bhaskar. If it hadn't been for the sudden appearance of Bhaskar, he would have been half-cooked by the flaming hands. Massive death energy erupted with a deafening roar, swallowing Bhaskar almost instantly. The sudden release of the death aura was like a gale, blowing up all over the sky. Splashing bone fragments hit the stone wall, making crisp, cracking sound as they landed. At this moment, the whole sky was shrouded in black mist. The death aura, like substance, was so overwhelming that everyone couldn't breathe. At this time even Orin and Mason thought that the battle was over. Being hit directly with a level 16 magic spell, there was almost no doubt that one would die even with the strength of a Lich. However, they overlooked one point: the Lich was an undead creature. It was more resistant to dark magic than any other creatures. Moreover, it had the elemental shield and the skeletal shield. These two newly erected shields could help it neutralize most of the damage. The direct hit of the death sentence severely wounded Bhaskar indeed. But, a severe wound was only a wound, they were still a little short of killing it. After the storm had dispersed, Bhaskar fell from the sky with a plop like a broken kite. At this point in time, it no longer looked like the prestigious lich it was. The loose black robe had long turned into ashes under the death sentence. Even the deathly white skeleton staff had disappeared without a trace. When the crowd looked over, hardly anyone could imagine that the wrecked bones before them were formerly powerful lich, Bhaskar. Among the people present, perhaps only Lin Li could imagine it. In fact, he had made preparations for it. After the release of the death sentence, he did not hesitate at all to open the ring of endless storm. He took out an item from inside that was enough to send Bhaskar into eternal despair. No! Bhaskar screamed again. It was a scream more desperate and more forlorn than before. It was because it suddenly saw that the mage with the High Lord's ring had taken out a weapon that was filled with the holy scent. Lin Li held in his hand a crossbow made of refined iron, and the pure holy scent was emitted from the silver bolt. At this moment, Bhaskar was regretting its guts out, if it had guts. If possible, it would really prefer to never appear and stay in its nest forever than encounter such a terrifying fellow. Look at what the unbelievable mage had done. The High Lord Osric's ring, was that something a human should have? In Bhaskar's time, that ring had taken the lives of countless mages. For a long time, the rebels could not help but tremble with fear every time they mentioned the ring. To think that he'd met with this thing again after 1,200 years. As for the refined iron crossbow, it had completely plunged Bhaskar into the depths of despair. The pure holy scent was the real nemesis of the undead creatures. Having lost his strength, Bhaskar could only watch the other party draw the crossbow, load it with the bolt that was filled with the holy scent, and then slowly raise it, aiming at his chest. After all this, Lin Li repeated what he had said before. Let's see who's the judge. Almost at the same time, a sliver of light had cut through the skies. The bolt, possessing the divine power, plunged accurately between the two will-o'-the-wisps, with its shadow in tow. No! The scream of the lich was filled with despair. Strong divine power erupted, and in an instant, only a silver blaze arose. The body of the lich was melting as fast as snow in the sunshine in the middle of this silver blaze. As the silver blaze grew stronger and stronger, the screams of the lich became fainter and fainter. Finally, it was completely turned into a pile of ashes. The lingering black mist cleared away at once, and the sky was blue again. With the death of Bhaskar, everything returned to its original tranquility. Phew! Standing in the place where Bhaskar died, Lin Li took in a breath heavily before bending down and gently pulling the bolt from the ashes. It was called the Sun Spike, and was among Lin Li's most unsuccessful investments so far. Why among? In addition to the Sun Spike, there was another one, Hollow Spike. The two crossbows, one of light and one of dark, had cost Lin Li a total of 200,000 gold coins. Back in the Endless World, Lin Li had spent a lot of thought in order to get these two crossbows. Who knew that shortly after acquiring them, the hunter had received the Stars of Fury? In addition to its amazing power, this mythical weapon also came with 7 bolts made of meteorite debris, each of which contained unparalleled power. With the 7 meteorite debris bolts in hand, the sun and hollow spikes were naturally no longer useful. The sharp weapons that were bought with 200,000 gold coins could only be set aside in the Ring of Endless Storm, such that for a long time afterwards, Lin Li was unable to raise his head because of this matter. He referred to them as his 2 most unsuccessful investments. He'd never thought that these 2 most unsuccessful investments would have suddenly erupted in another world, killing Bhaskar, who could not even be destroyed by the death sentence, in one fell swoop. Lin Li kept the Sun Spike back into the Ring of Endless Storm, then looked at the ashes on the ground, and spoke without any rhyme or reason. You died justly. Lin Li was about to leave after uttering these words that he himself did not even understand when he suddenly discovered thick, black mist surging up from the pile of ashes. Damn! With the previous experience, Lin Li took out the strange crystal from his pocket without any hesitation this time. Then, he saw that thick, black mist pouring into the crystal as if attracted by some kind of force. With the continuous influx of the black mist, the crystal in his hand began to warm up, just like when he had entered the Shadow Glen. I get it, this time. He really understood. Lin Li was even certain that among the many ManhwaRecaps engraved on the crystal, one had to be used to absorb the power of death. After the power of death was absorbed, some of it had to be converted into mana to maintain the normal functioning of that huge ManhwaRecap array, while the rest was stored. When this power reached its limit, the creature that was sealed in it could be activated. It was like the other night, when the shapeshifter suddenly appeared as they were dealing with the high-level vampire. Of course. All these were merely Lin Li's speculations. The secrets of the crystal could only be unraveled after he had studied the ManhwaRecap array thoroughly. Even with Lin Li's strength as an inscription guru, it was not an easy thing to study that ManhwaRecap array thoroughly. It was an extremely huge and complicated process. Lin Li would need a lot of time to understand and analyze it, and the Shadow Glen was obviously not a suitable place to do that. Lin Li shook his head helplessly. He threw the maroon crystal into his pocket, then slowly walked back to the cave. When he returned to the cave, almost everyone was looking at him as if they were looking at a dinosaur. The others were not to be blamed for making a fuss. Why did he have to behave in such a perverse manner in the first place? Think back to what he'd done. He had absorbed the death sentence with the torrent of elements, and then released it instantaneously, severely wounding the powerful lich. And he wasn't done after all this. He had pulled out a crossbow that was emitting massive divine power. Having done such a wicked thing, he couldn't blame others for looking at him as if he was a dinosaur. When the lich was turned into ashes, almost all of them wanted to strangle him by his neck and ask, "Do you dare to be a little more perverse?" Alright, he wouldn't dare anymore. The rest of the day was calm. Not to mention powerful undead creatures like the lich, even creatures such as the skeletal warriors had no chance to appear in the public eye, and Lin Li naturally had no occasion to display his perverseness. That night, Kayla and others were not driven out of the cave. Lin Li's explanation was that they did well during the day, so this was a reward for them. In the past, Frederick would have been furious, but after the day's battle, he was almost turning crazy. How could he have the courage to be furious? After nightfall, Frederick found a corner and spread his blanket meekly. In order to be on the safe side, he even asked Sarsen to help lay a ward of secrecy around him before going to bed for fear of snoring in the middle of the night and bringing disaster to himself. At dusk the next day, the 7 days trial finally came to an end. When the melodious bell sounded over Shadow Glen, Kayla and the others could hardly wait to pull out their teleportation scrolls. No one wanted to stay in a ghostly place like the Shadow Glen, let alone live in a cave and be subjected to the changing moods of a freak. Lin Li was just recovering from the giddiness brought about by the teleportation when he saw Macklin's drab, old face. "You boys, get out and take a shower. Are you all trying to stink me to death?" the old man chided, but the joy in his tone could not be concealed. In any case, he was the trial mentor. His disciples had lived in the Shadow Glen for 7 days, and had completed the trial mission with an almost perfect result. It was absolutely a lie to say that he was unhappy. In fact, although the old fellow was outwardly scolding them, he was actually blooming with joy in his heart. These few kids had not let him down. Indeed, Macklin knew better how dangerous the Shadow Glen was. Even he himself didn't expect the boys could really last for 7 days. "Damn, let's see if that idiot, Darien, has anything else to say," Macklin scolded fiercely as he watched the 3 figures recede. He was utterly browned off by Darien in the past few days. Darien was also some genius. While Lin Li and others were fulfilling their trial missions in the Shadow Glen, he had come to Macklin every single day to persuade the latter to deal with the Gerosis mage who had hurt his nephew. Macklin really didn't understand why he had such great energy. In the past 7 days, Darien had been reporting in his tent after lunch every day. He'd begin with criticizing Jirian, who was far away in Gerosis. He'd talk about how impolite, how arrogant, how overbearing, and how cruel he was. In short, all the adjectives that could slander one were used on the fat man. Then it was Felix's turn. Every time he mentioned this matter, Darien would put on a tragic face, desperately trying to accuse the country mage from Gerosis of how nasty he was, as well as how perverse a method he had used to mutilate his nephew. He also said that although his nephew had not contributed much to the Guild of Magic in recent years, he had been diligent after all. It was a pity that no one had spoken up for him even though he was badly injured, etc. Fuck, Macklin was boiling with anger at the thought of this. He wanted to throttle Darien and ask, "Are you fucking done with this?" Unfortunately, Darien was an archmage, after all. He was also an important member of the Alana Guild of Magic. Even if Macklin was upset, he still had to show him some due respect on the surface. Macklin really had had enough of it these days. The bombardment of words every day had almost brought him a mental breakdown. He swore that when the trial was over, he would find a way to transfer that idiot, Darien, to a remote mountainous area. If possible, he'd send him to the ogre's nest so that he couldn't appear in Alana for the rest of his life. However, it was all right now. These three boys had completed the trial mission of the Supreme Council. From today onwards, they'd be the young mages that the Supreme Council would pay special attention to. Damn you, Darien. Go and find trouble with the Supreme Council if you have the ability. What's the use of pestering me every day, the old fellow thought shamelessly. I'd like to see if the people from the Supreme Council are cultured like me. Good evening, Mr. Macklin. Lin Li and others took a comfortable hot bath and each changed into a clean mage robe. All three of them looked refreshed at present. How is it, you didn't encounter too big of a trouble in the Shadowglen, right? Macklin was in a good mood, having solved a big problem, which was Darien. He was showing concern for his disciples, something that was rare of him. Mason swallowed his saliva. As a matter of fact, he wanted to ask Macklin, is a vampire above level 18 and a lich of at least level 16 considered too big of a trouble? We didn't encounter that big a trouble, Lin Li nodded his head and smiled with ease, but we saw two groups of undead fighting each other. I wonder what was that about. Damn. Macklin was taken aback. He hurriedly called the three guys into his tent, and after looking around and making sure that no one was eavesdropping, he lowered his voice and asked, "You boys really saw two groups of undead fighting each other?" Yes, it was splendid. Mason was already talking with great rapture without waiting for Lin Li to speak. From the thousands of skeletal warriors to the large number of high-level undead creatures creeping from the depths of Shadowglen, this fellow always liked to exaggerate, so everything about the size of a sesame was described as a watermelon in his mouth. Besides, the war of the undead was so great in power and impetus that it sounded like the end of the world coming from him. Even someone with great experience like Macklin was taken aback by it. Damn, you guys are lucky. After Macklin heard from them, he remained dazed for a long while before sighing with emotion. Do you guys know why the undead were fighting each other? Mason was startled. Could it be a crime of passion? Macklin almost slapped Mason on the head. Crime of passion from the undead creatures? You can kill one for me to see. Was someone manipulating them in the dark? Lin Li probed. Half right. Macklin nodded, and then went on to say, they were not manipulated by human beings, but by two powerful undead creatures, one a level 22 lich, and the other a level 22 skeletal lord. For some reasons unknown, these two creatures have been fighting for a long time since the Dark Ages. Almost every once in a while, they will start a large-scale war of the undead. Seriously? Two level 20 undead creatures? Lin Li started in fright. Do you know how bad it was now? That's why I said that you boys were lucky enough to be involved in such a fight and still come back alive. The three of them broke out in a cold sweat at Macklin's words. Mason and Oren felt extremely thankful. Luckily, they were grouped with Felix. If it hadn't been for his petrifying potion, they might have been captured by the group of undead creatures and presented to the two powerful undead lords as tribute. Alright, cut the crap, now let's get on with business. What business? You all have done well this time. Macklin's creepy old face revealed a rare hint of admiration. 24 mages participated in the trial, but only 13 completed it, and you boys made up 3 of them. Before you left, I told you that this trial was decided by the Supreme Council. That is to say, The reward for accomplishing the mission will also be issued by the Supreme Council. Reward? Mason's eyes lit up at once. Yes, reward. The old man was in a good mood. His disciples were rewarded by the Supreme Council. As their trial mentor, he was naturally proud of it. Heh, Mr. Macklin, can you tell us in advance what kind of reward is the Supreme Council giving us? No. Damn. But I can disclose in advance the Alana Guild of Magic's reward to you. The old man grinned and whispered, Congratulations, you are free to enter and exit the Omniscient Tower for the next 2 months. Really? Not to mention Mason, even Oren and Lin Li's eyes lit up at the mention of it. What kind of place was the Omniscient Tower? It was the largest library in the whole Felon Kingdom. For mages, the Omniscient Tower was an absolute treasure house of magic. The vast majority of spells circulated in Amril today could be found in it. Moreover, every mage who had ever entered the Omniscient Tower would leave a reading note in it. To some extent, this reading note was equivalent to a mage's lifelong research experience. This was not a joking matter. No matter how incompetent a mage was, he would acquire some unique skills more or less in the decades and centuries of research. These skills were the most precious gift in the world for mages. Moreover, which of the mages who could enter the Omniscient Tower were incompetent stuff? For the mages of the Felon Kingdom, the Omniscient Tower was a true holy land of magic. Even Lin Li couldn't help but get excited at the thought of being able to enter the Omniscient Tower. Forget about those lost spells, those reading notes were something really precious things to him. After all, he was exposed to magic only for a short period of time. Although Anduin had laid a solid foundation for him, he had no time to master some of the more peculiar spellcasting skills. If he could enter the Omniscient Tower, his strength could at least be raised to a higher level. Lin Li pondered, and asked with some doubt, By the way, Mr. Macklin, if we go to the Omniscient Tower to study, will we have enough time to complete the next trial mission? Trial mission? Macklin chided angrily. What other trial missions are there? You have accomplished the mission issued by the Supreme Council. Would I possibly make you stay in the Shadow Glen for another month? Then. There's no more trial missions. Macklin's reply was very simple this time. In the next 2 months or so, you can stay at the Omniscient Tower every day to study as you await the finals, and then you guys can go back to your guilds. This isn't bad. Alright, we're done here. You boys, quickly pack your things and return to Alana with me. The party of 4 returned to the Alana Guild of Magic after a bumpy carriage ride. Oh, right, Felix, wait a minute. I have something to discuss with you. Macklin stopped Lin Li after they'd entered the guild hall. Mr. Macklin, what's the matter? After the old man stopped Lin Li, he stood there and rubbed his hands in embarrassment. It seemed that he didn't know how to broach the subject. Mr. Macklin, is it about magical weapons? Lin Li knew what the old man wished to say upon seeing the latter's expression. The old fellow had to be worried and want Lin Li to give him some assurance, but he was afraid he'd anger Lin Li with his words, so he was all shilly-shallying there, acting like a sissy. Yes. Do you want me to forge one now? Yes, the old fellow nodded in succession. Sure. Lin Li's straightforward reply was totally unexpected to Macklin, such that the old fellow stood there dazed for a long time before coming to a realization. For a moment, his smiles were all about flattery. That's great. I knew you're honest and kind. Come. Let's slowly talk about it in the smithy. Macklin heaved a long sigh of relief when he led Lin Li out of the guild hall. To be honest, he was afraid that this kid would not agree, and even more afraid that his words would offend him. The sentence earlier on was euphemistic, but the worry was undoubtedly expressed. Macklin had lived for a long enough time to understand that anyone who had a certain ability would inevitably have some strange temper, especially in the field where they were good at. No one could tolerate the slightest doubt. It was like the kid in front of him, he seemed to be very easy to talk to, but Macklin knew very well that this kid had a more terrific temper than anybody else. Luckily, the kid was understanding today. At the thought of this, the old fellow heaved a sigh of relief. Lin Li did not speak as he followed Macklin out of the guild hall. He could understand Macklin's feelings. After all, it was a bet on the future of the guild. Even if the old man had trust in him, it was entirely reasonable for him to be worried as well. It was not too much trouble for Lin Li if he could use a weapon to calm the old man down. Furthermore, he had just obtained 2 fangs and a magical crystal. He could mighty well make use of this opportunity to put them to good use.
Aldwin had been waiting outside the smithy for a long while by the time the two had come. The president, who had always been calm and composed, was quite different today. There was anxiety all over his aged face. His moping disposition made it really hard for people to relate him with the strongest mage and felon. At present, Alana was pacing around anxiously with his hands behind his back. He did not look like the president of the Alana Guild of Magic, but rather like an ant crawling on a hot pot. It was not until Macklin and Lin Li's figures appeared at the other end of the corridor that Aldwin finally showed a somewhat relieved expression on his face. "Sorry to trouble you, Felix." The president came forward with an apologetic smile on his face. "It's nothing." Lin Li smiled. He was not unhappy. This concerned the future of the guild after all. He'd most likely be like Aldwin if he were to be in the latter's position. Anyway, there were also 2 vampire fangs that needed to be studied. It'd only take him a little more time to let the 2 of them completely rest assured, lest both should have to worry all day long even when they were getting old. In case something went wrong one day, wouldn't he have committed a sin? Felix. Aldwin hesitated for a while, and took out something from his pocket. It was a yellowish parchment that looked like it had been around for some years. There were still some burn marks on the corners and the edges. It looked like it was caused by spatters of sparks. "Take a look at this and see if you have confidence in this." Lin Li was puzzled at first. When he took the parchment and looked at it, he realized that it was a blueprint of the Frost Shadowbane. Well, there should be no problem. Lin Li scratched his head. He really didn't know how to explain it to Aldwin at that moment. The Frost Shadowbane was the lowest level magical weapon. Any blacksmith who had reached the higher tier of mastery did not require any blueprint to forge the Frost Shadowbane. What was more, Lin Li was someone who was at the top of the forging profession. However, it was impossible to explain such a thing. Anyway, Lin Li had already received the blueprint. He had no option but to hold onto it for the time being. Seeing the strange look on Lin Li's face, Aldwin thought he was lacking in confidence, and hurriedly comforted him with a few words. "All you have to do is try your best. We still have time. Even if it's not successful, it's not a big deal." "I will." Lin Li nodded and said nothing more. He took the blueprint and went into the smithy. After closing the door behind him, Lin Li smoothly threw several pieces of refined iron into the furnace. Then, he opened the Ring of Endless Storm, and began to study the fangs of the 2 vampires. On the day he had obtained the fangs, Lin Li was going to set them on a dagger. After all, mages were not warriors. Excessive use of metal weapons would affect the control of mana. After careful thought, the only weapon he could use for close combat was probably a dagger. But the battle with the Lich had changed Lin Li's mind. When the sun spike was fired, a sudden thought popped up in his mind: why not make a crossbow for himself? Although the dagger was light and convenient, its power was really limited. He was a mage, above all, and had few opportunities to fight in close quarters. Even if the dagger was inlaid with vampire fangs, it'd still be very difficult to exert its power. But it would be different if it were a crossbow bolt. It was similarly light and convenient, but the power was much greater. It could be used both at a long range or a close range, and it could be used on a variety of powerful crossbows, such as the Sun and Hollow Spike that was stored in the Ring of Endless Storm. Also, perhaps there were few people who were more proficient than Lin Li in shooting enemies from a long distance. Before he came to this world, he was a super hunter. Lin Li threw the refined iron into the furnace. He had already outlined several designs in his mind. As a smithing guru, countless of crossbow blueprints had been installed in his mind. What he needed to do now was to choose a scheme from these blueprints that could give full play to the vampire fangs. Meanwhile, the two most important figures in the Alana Guild of Magic were pacing back and forth restlessly like ants on a hot pan. "Say, do you think the kid can do it?" Macklin frowned firmly such that his brows were almost coming together. "I don't know." The president's face was not much better than Macklin's. Since breaking through the legendary realm, he had probably never been as nervous as today. The Adventurers Guild had already found an inscriber who could chart high-level magewebs as early as 6 months ago. In contrast, the Alana Guild of Magic took a full year to find Felix, their only hope. The Alana Guild of Magic today could be said to be pushed onto the edge of a cliff. This was a big deal. Aldwin couldn't help being nervous. Perhaps not even Aldwin himself had imagined that, one day, he would hand over the fate of the guild to a young mage under the age of 20. Too young, Aldwin shook his head in spite of himself at the thought of this. This was the point Aldwin was worried about. Felix was simply too young. Although Aldwin's forging level was not much, he had nevertheless done some research on this profession. He knew that forging in general was not difficult. As long as one was strong enough to pull the bellows and lift the hammer, one could forge a decent piece of equipment, but once it came down to the field of magical equipment, it was another matter altogether. Aldwin had studied the blueprint of the Frost Shadowbane for at least a month. He knew very well that the blueprint of magical weapons was no simpler than a magic shooter-level spell. It required too much expertise. If one didn't spend a lot of time on it, one wouldn't be able to figure out the ropes. There was no doubt that Felix was a real genius, otherwise, he would not have reached the rank of a level 13 magic shooter at the age of only 20. But even the most talented person couldn't stop the flow of time. Becoming a blacksmith required a large amount of time. How could he have enough experience when he was in his 20s? The president paced back and forth with his hands behind his back outside the smithy. Felix had been inside for almost half an hour, and there wasn't any sound of hammering yet. Aldwin was really worried. Could something be wrong, seeing that there hadn't been any movement inside for such a long time? It happened that, at this time, Macklin had to ask with a face of apprehension, "Say, if it doesn't work." Aldwin shot him a threatening look. This fellow just had to rub his nose in it. Was he trying to make him anxious by saying such discouraging words at this point in time? Ding, dang, ding, dang. At this moment, there was finally the sound of clanking coming from the forging workshop. When the sound of iron being hit came, the two top figures in magic rushed forward almost at the same time, desperately sticking their ears to the door, hoping to recognize the forging progress through this crisp sound of clanking. The two of them could be regarded as the top mages even in the entire Felon Kingdom. However, they were two real rookies in the field of forging. As they put their ears to the door, it was merely to console themselves, for they could not even make a thing out of it at all. Before they could make out something, the loud clanking noise ceased, and then there was a soft sizzling. That's all. Macklin remembered the sound, drawing from his half-baked forging experience. It seemed to be quenching. No way, Aldwin did not believe it. He stuck his ear to the door to listen once more. But before he could lean his head over, the door opened with a creak. Then, they saw Lin Li walk out of the smithy with a smile on his face. Done. Macklin opened his mouth. His wretched face was full of incredulity. Done. Lin Li nodded. He stretched out his hand, pointing to the anvil in the workshop. The two men looked along the direction of Lin Li's finger, and saw a single-handed sword lying quietly on the anvil. A faint magical wave slowly passed from the polished sword. Wrong. Macklin was about to enter the door when he suddenly noticed a slight abnormality. The magical wave on the one-handed sword seemed different from what he imagined. Theoretically, ice magical element should pervade the Frost Shadowbane. How could he sense a scorching aura on this sword? How come it's of fire magical element? Aldwin was confused as well. After carefully taking in the magical aura on the one-handed sword, he shook his head again. No, it's not only fire magical element but also ice magic element. Felix, what is going on? How can there be two kinds of magical elements? Ha ha, Lin Li scratched his head and smiled, embarrassed. I just suddenly remembered that I seemed to have forgotten how to forge the Frost Shadowbane, and seeing that the materials were just right, I conveniently made a Frostfire sword. Macklin nearly banged his head on the wall upon hearing it. What did the kid just say? He seemed to say, conveniently made a Frostfire sword. Bloody hell. The Frostfire sword could also be conveniently forged. Macklin almost had a heart attack at those words. The old man was an archmage at any rate. How could he not know what the Frostfire sword was? This was a weapon with two magical attributes, and they were fire and ice, no less. To integrate these two completely conflicting attributes into a weapon was not something as easy as 1 + 1 = 2. Even if they were to look all over Alana, they might not be able to find several blacksmiths who could forge the Frostfire sword. Macklin knew very well that a blacksmith who could forge a Frostfire sword had at least an advanced forging level, and might even approach the legendary master of forging. High-level blacksmith, Macklin had the sense he was going crazy just at the thought of it. A mage with an advanced forging level, what was the difference between this and a herbivorous dragon? Oh no. It was something rarer than a herbivore dragon. After all, the dragon could be forced into being a herbivore, but there might only be a mage with advanced forging skills in the whole of Anril, and that was Felix. Fuck, pervert, Macklin held back for long before finally choking these two words out. He really understood now that this kid could not be measured by human standards. Age, experience, and genius were of no significance to this kid at all. He was a living dinosaur, there'd only be things you couldn't think of, but there'd never be things that he couldn't do. Lin Li waited there for a long time, but there was nothing that followed from Macklin. So he had to remind him conscientiously, Mr. Macklin, if there's nothing else, can I go back to my room first? You know, the mission this time was really somewhat. After being asked by Lin Li, Macklin came to his senses, and hurriedly stepped aside to make way for Lin Li. Before leaving, Macklin reminded him with a simper, oh, yes. Go back and take a rest. Do take a good rest, don't tire yourself out. Then, goodbye. Goodbye. When returning to the guild hall, Lin Li reached into his pocket and touched the two crossbow bolts, which still had some lingering warmth. His biggest harvest going to the smithy today was those two. He was itching to find a place to try them now. How powerful would these two crossbow bolts forged with the vampire fangs be?
I'll write to Jirian right away. Macklin stood at the door of the smithy and looked at the Frostfire sword with a glazed expression on his face. After staring at it for more than half an hour, he finally said, I must have a good talk with that fatty Jirian. There's no need to write. Aldwin's face was also glazed, but as president of the Alana Guild of Magic, his vision reached farther than Macklin's. Jirian will not let him go. I just learned 2 days ago that the Emerald Tower has unified the whole city of Gerosis, and all this happened in 2 months. Just think, didn't Felix complete his level certification in Gerosis Guild of Magic 2 months ago? Jirian must be clearer about Felix than us. With his character, how could he easily let him go? Jirian, this darned fatty, Macklin thought for a moment, and knew that the president was telling the truth. It had not been a year or two since he knew Jirian. How could he not know that this arrogant-looking, seemingly unscheming fat man was actually more cunning than a fox? Macklin could even be sure that the reason why Felix participated in this trial as a level 7 mage was mostly Jirian's idea. Why a level 7 mage? Wasn't it because the fat man was worried that Felix was so outstanding that the Alana Guild of Magic, and even the Supreme Council, would covet him? Damn it, letting a level 12 magic shooter disguise as a level 7 mage, this darned fatty was indeed despicable to think of such thing. Macklin really wanted to ask Jirian, why didn't you just let him come as a mage apprentice instead? Is there really nothing you can do about it? Macklin kept thinking about it, he refused to give up. Felix was simply too outstanding, there might not be another such talent like him in hundreds of years. No matter how, Macklin was unwilling to see him slip away from his own hands. It's very difficult. Aldwin stared at the Frostfire sword, which was emitting a faint magical wave. In the smithy, there was some helplessness in his expression. To be honest, compared with the Emerald Tower, we have no advantage at all. Why not? We are the top guild of magic in the Felon Kingdom. We can offer the best treatment to the members of the guild, including magical equipment, research materials, spells, and even the opportunity to receive guidance from the Supreme Council. Can the Emerald Tower afford these things? Aldwin shook his head. The question is, do you think these advantages are of any significance? Macklin opened his mouth and wanted to refute Aldwin, but after pondering it over, he suddenly realized that Aldwin was right. These things, which an ordinary mage longed for, seemed to be meaningless to that freak. Magical equipment needn't be mentioned, he was a pharmacist cum blacksmith. He could just move his hands, and innumerable gold coins would be pouring down from the sky. He could just spend all the money he wanted for any magical equipment. Was there still a need for the guild to provide it? The same was true for research materials. As long as you had money, there would naturally be a lot of adventurers willing to contribute to you. What research materials were beyond your reach? Of course, the top-level ones were certainly not possible. After all, those things had gone beyond the scope of money. The problem was, the Alana Guild of Magic was similarly unable to provide the aforementioned top-level equipment and materials that had gone beyond the scope of money. As for the various kinds of spells, don't even mention it. What was his relationship with Anduin? The old fellow was the authority on High Elf's relics. He probably held more lost spells than the whole of Alana Guild of Magic combined. Damn, Macklin mulled it over for a long time, and had to admit gloomily that compared to the darned fatty's Emerald Tower, the Alana Guild of Magic really had no advantage at all. However, hearing Macklin's curse, Aldwin's face revealed a hint of smile. Frankly speaking, it's not true that there's no way around this matter at all. Oh? Macklin started, and asked eagerly, what ways are there? Felix has been in Alana for about 10 days, right? You are his trial mentor. Think carefully about what he has done in these 10 days. Macklin listened with a blank face. He couldn't understand why Aldwin had suddenly asked such a question. In his opinion, the question was too simple. What the kid had done in the past 10 days could be summed up in 2 words, terrifying and provocative. A trial mentor for this kid was like audience of horror stories. He was in a state of shock from the beginning to the end. For the past 10 days, the kid had been doing the same thing, constantly using various abnormal ways to frighten everyone who knew him. In particular, his 2 poor teammates. Macklin really sympathized with the 2 little fellows. They had taken part in the trial, together with such a monster. If their psychological qualities were slightly weaker, they would have been frightened out of their nerves long ago. Apart from this, what the fellow loved to do was to stir up trouble. This bizarre hobby of his troubled Macklin. He was only in Alana for 10 days, but had crippled 2 men. It was more atrocious than Darian back then. Needless to say, Darian's nephew was inexplicably beaten into a cripple, such that Darian had come to him every day, wailing and demanding him to give an explanation, especially while they were in the Shadowglen the past few days. This fellow was only short of moving his sleeping bag into Macklin's tent. Oh, right. Then, there was Matthias. Compared with Darian's useless nephew, breaking Matthias' limbs was a greater headache to Macklin. This matter could be said to be quite troublesome. Matthias himself was not very outstanding, but his family held considerable power in the Felon Kingdom. At first, the Guild of Magic went through a lot of trouble to calm this matter down. Eventually, even Aldwin himself had spoken up, so the matter was finally suppressed for the time being. But, it was only temporary. Matthias knew that this matter was far from over. This kid is really, Macklin thought over it for a long time, and even startled himself. Why hadn't he noticed before that this kid was such a troublemaker? Whether it's Madrick or Matthias, the reason why Felix clashed with them is the same. Macklin's eyes brightened suddenly at these words. Yes, both conflicts were in full view of the public. As his trial mentor, he had also inquired witnesses about it. Madrick had attacked Felix's attendant, while Matthias had attacked Felix's teammate. From these 2 events, it could be concluded that this kid was someone who would shield the shortcomings of his acquaintances. He would dare to kill anyone who dared to lay a hand on his friends. Macklin picked at a few strands of his goat-like beard. After pondering for a long time, he asked doubtfully, "Do you mean we should start with Felix friends?" "No, no, no. That's too obvious." Aldwin shook his head, and a hint of smile loomed on his face. "This young man is smarter than you think. This apparent rope-in is meaningless to him. We need to be more implicit." "What kind of implicit?" "Emerald Tower." Macklin almost spat out a mouthful of blood. After half a day's work, it was still Gerosis. What was the difference between that and not saying? In fact, it is very simple. What we have to do is to strive for the interests of the Emerald Tower as much as possible and win the favor of this young man in this way. Aren't we benefiting that darned fatty too much? There's nothing benefiting or not. Do you think people like Felix will stay in the Felon Kingdom all the time? The Felon Kingdom won't be able to keep him. Young people like Felix will come into contact with the larger world sooner or later. By that time, there will be no difference whether he belongs to the Emerald Tower or the Alana Guild of Magic. All we have to do is to win his friendship before that. That's enough. But, with this kid around, will other benefits interest the Emerald Tower? No one would dislike having too much benefits. When Isaac came back the other day, he mentioned to me that the Emerald Tower was entangled with a force called the Shadow's Nest. Maybe we can think of something about it. All right, I will handle this matter. The two most important figures of the Alana Guild of Magic stood outside the smithy and talked for almost 2 to 3 hours before deciding on the whole matter. When Macklin left, there was a glimmer of a smile on his grim face. Lin Li held the crossbow bolts made with 2 vampire fangs and walked slowly all the way back to his dormitory. Just as he opened the door, he saw 3 guys gorging on their food. "What are you doing?" Lin Li was appalled. Forget about Sean, he was a bear, anyway. But when did Mason and Oren, these 2 genteel and refined mages, learn to eat so crudely? Felix, Mason shoved 2 pieces of bread into his mouth. Then, he raised his head in a hurry and gave an ambiguous greeting, "Come quick, I've left you something to eat." "Why are you all so hungry?" Lin Li remembered that everyone had eaten something before returning from the Shadow Glen. How had they all turned into hungry ghosts in just a few hours? "We must hurry." Warren tore up a small piece of bread and put it into his mouth. It seemed very gentle, but the frequency with which he delivered food to his mouth was a little frightening. In the duration of this sentence, he had eaten more than Mason. The Omniscient Tower is closing. Lin Li then remembered that the Omniscient Tower was only opened from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., and looking out at the sky, it seemed that there was not much time left until 9 p.m. No wonder the 2 guys were eating so ferociously. But why was Sean following them? "Sean, you have some matter too?" Hearing Lin Li's inquiry, Sean quickly put down his food and answered honestly, "No, Mr. Felix." "Then, why are you eating so ferociously as well?" "I'm hungry." Lin Li shook his head, then grabbed a piece of bread from the table and went back to his room. "Felix, you're not eating?" "I'll just eat some bread. Remember to call me when you're going out." Lin Li closed the door gently. He fumbled about in his pocket and took out the crossbow bolts made of the 2 vampire fangs. At first, he wanted to use the vampire fangs on the crossbows, but when he finished studying the crossbow blueprint, it suddenly occurred to him that they were all long-range weapons anyway, so it was better to simply make them into bolts. So, the original plan was changed again. 2 high-level vampire fangs became 2 bolts that could absorb the enemy's power. But, at present, these 2 bolts were only half-finished products. They had to be charted with a mageweth before they could be considered complete. Lin Li shut the door, intending to do so. The 2 bolts were placed at the head of the bed. Lin Li opened the ring of endless storm and took out a bottle of navy sand and a thin crystal pen from inside. Because it was made with vampire fangs, the power of these 2 bolts had to be sufficient. Once the power was absorbed, even the most powerful enemy would inevitably become weak. Therefore, Lin Li did not need to use mageweth to enhance the power of bolts. What he needed to consider now was how to properly utilize this absorbed power. it was definitely not possible to transfer it directly to oneself. First of all, it was too complicated. The transfer of power itself was a huge and complex process. Moreover, the direct acquisition of power from equipment as it was currently would not necessarily produce an ideal result even if it was a mageweth of the guru level. Secondly, it was too dangerous. The power absorbed by the bolt had to exist in various forms. Perhaps it could be magic, or combat energy, its attributes varied as well. From light to darkness, there were all kinds of attributes. If he were to combine the various attributes of this power, he would surely end up in a miserable situation. It was like a certain eminent monk who had integrated the power by force. At the end of the day, he was possessed, and had to find someone to help him purge it out. What was the point of it? Lin Li mulled it over, and still thought it safer not to make rash decisions. Since it was the power absorbed by the bolt, it was better to keep it for himself. He had bled a lot in order to achieve this goal. It was no exaggeration to say that this was the most severe bleeding after he had transmigrated. In order not to waste the 2 fangs of the high-level vampire, Lin Li gritted his teeth and used the divinity metal from the nest of the dragon of destruction. Although only a layer was plated on the bolt, that thin layer had used up nearly 1/3 of his divinity metal. Lin Li's hands were shaking when he was plating the divinity metal on the bolt. This was something that would deplete with every use. It was totally a different concept from herbs. Herbs could be collected from many places. With his mastery knowledge of herbs, Lin Li had never worried about the source of his herbs. Even for the legendary Black Lotus, at least he knew that it could be found at the Fire Plume Ridge. Although the cave sounded troublesome, it was not impossible to get it with some good planning. But, where could the divinity metal be mined? It was found in the nest of the Dragon of Destruction, Azardas. Devil knew whether there'd be another Dragon of Destruction in Amrel. Besides, so what if there was another one? Back then, the hunter was armed with the legendary weapon, the Stars of Fury. It was only by chance that the Dragon of Destruction was killed. Now that he had transmigrated into another world, who could guarantee that he still had such good luck? However, after a thin layer of divinity metal was plated, the level of the 2 bolts was raised almost instantaneously. There was a leap forward, whether in terms of destructive power or absorbing power. And, the most valuable thing was the growth brought about by the divinity metal. With the help of 2 high-level vampire fangs, this growth had been maximized. This growth might not be reflected in the beginning, but as the number of battles it had been in increased, the power drawn by the vampire's fangs became larger and larger, and the divinity metal would gradually show its tremendous power. These 2 bolts were bound to become stronger and stronger. In the end, perhaps even Lin Li himself wouldn't be able to figure out how far they could grow. What Lin Li had to do, at present, was to set a direction for their growth. The power drawn by the vampire's fangs would ultimately determine the direction of growth for the 2 bolts, and this direction would be determined by the mageweth that Lin Li would soon chart. Lin Li gently pinched the crystal pen and dipped it in a little star sand. After staring at the bolt thoughtfully for a moment, the first line was drawn on it. The 3 adjacent magic nodes in the central position formed an inverted triangle, and beside the inverted triangle were 6 magic circuits. The significance of their existence was to ensure the normal operation of the 3 magic nodes. This was the embryonic form of the mass energy ward. With only a few strokes, Lin Li had outlined the embryonic form of the mass energy ward. In the meantime, it was also decided that this bolt, plated with the divinity metal, would become magical equipment with strong elemental power. The significance of the mass energy ward lay in converting power into mana and purifying it in the process of conversion. After the conversion by the mass energy ward, any form of power could be stored in the form of elements. It only required a trace of mental strength to be stimulated, and then it would erupt into a mighty power. The most common use of the mass energy ward was a mage's magic staff. Only through the mass energy ward could the power contained in the magical crystal be converted into the purest form of mana. And what Lin Li was going to do was 100 times more complicated than this. He would draw a complex mageweth on top of the thin bolt. The difficulty of it was similar to dancing on a needle tip. Lin Li held the crystal pen, and his wrist was quivering gently. It looked like he was having a convulsion. Only careful observation could reveal that he had drawn a series of lines amidst the weird tremors. Phew, Lin Li breathed a long sigh of relief after laying down the last magic circuit. As a mass energy ward was laid down, Lin Li could clearly see a faint halo flowing over the bolt. This was the power of the high-level vampire Feng itself. As more and more power was absorbed in the future, this halo would become more and more intense. After relishing in contentment, Lin Li was about to pick up the other bolt when he suddenly heard a knock at the door. "Felix, hurry and open the door. We're about to leave." After hearing Mason's voice, Lin Li suddenly remembered that there was still work to be done. It seemed that the mage on this bolt could only wait until he returned at night. Coming. Lin Li kept the stuff into the ring of endless storm before coming out from the bedroom. He saw Mason and Oren waiting outside as soon as he opened the door. Lin Li pondered and called Sean over again. "Sean." "Yes, Mr. Felix? Remember, you're still sleeping in my room tonight. Don't run into the living room to sleep, or you'll be in trouble, do you understand?" Lin Li warned Sean again before going out. He was afraid that the kid would sleep in the living room on his own initiative, seeing that he had returned. Then, there would be no protection of the ward of secrecy. His earth-shaking snoring could possibly lift the whole building. Sean nodded honestly, but his face was full of confusion. He could not understand why Mr. Felix would attach such importance to this matter. "Remember, don't sleep in the living room." After reminding Sean once more, Lin Li went out of the door with his two teammates. They walked all the way to the guild hall along the path lined with sycamore trees. The Omniscient Tower was definitely the core even in the entire Alana Guild of Magic. The three of them soon felt the position of the core building when they came out of the guild hall and walked down the corridor to the Omniscient Tower. They were questioned at least 10 times in less than 10 minutes. On average, the time spent on the road was not as long as the time spent being questioned. After passing through a long corridor, the three people suddenly saw light ahead. In front of them was a mass of flowers and greenery. The environment looked even better than the place where they lived. Before them, a tall tower shot straight into the clouds. It looked majestic and imposing from afar, filled with a dignified yet mysterious aura. Just beside the tower, there was another huge building, which occupied almost half of the surrounding space. The three of them had just approached when they felt a strong magical wave. According to Mason, this was the Alana Research Institute, where the core magic research in the guild was located. It was said that the person who presided over the Research Institute was a legendary mage, with strength not below Aldwin's. However, this legendary mage had been lying low as he did his research. He had never appeared in public for decades. No one, including Mason's resourceful uncle, knew how the dean really looked like. The three of them crossed the lush, green lawn, and very soon arrived before the high tower. Two middle-aged mages in black robes were stationed at the gate of the tower. Lin Li was startled as he approached the gate. The two middle-aged mages stationed here actually possessed the strength of an archmage each. They were again interrogated by the two archmages. The interrogation was more detailed than the ones they met on the way here. Finally, after Mason displayed their identity certificates, the three of them were able to enter the legendary Omniscient Tower. "This is your pass. It is valid for 2.5 months. In the next 2.5 months, you can freely enter and exit the Omniscient Tower with this pass. However, there are several things I must remind you about. The Omniscient Tower is open from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. After handing over the 3 metal nameplates to the three of them respectively, a middle-aged mage repeated the matters needing attention. In addition, the place where you can freely enter and leave is only between the 1st floor and the 15th floor. Beyond the 15th floor, you must gain permission from Dean Baron personally. Also, within the Omniscient Tower, there must be no loud noise, no magic, no physical conflict, no destruction of books, no." The middle-aged mage mentioned a dozen of no's in succession, and the three of them could not help but feel their scalps turn numb. "Haha, I'll go up to the 10th floor first. After waiting for the middle-aged mage to finish listing the dozen prohibitions at last, Mason was already eagerly holding his pass and heading straight up the spiral staircase. Before he left, he said wretchedly, "I wonder what treasures are hidden on the 10th floor. See you at 9. Walking into the largest magic treasure house in the Felon Kingdom, there were perhaps few mages that would not be moved. Warren left a few words hastily, and disappeared in a twinkling of an eye. Okay, see you at 9. After separating from his two teammates by the steps, Lin Li did not rush to the upper floors, but went straight through the corridor to the hall on the first floor of the Omniscient Tower. Coming in from the main entrance of the hall, Lin Li saw a row of huge bookshelves that were filled with all kinds of books. A large desk was placed in the middle of these bookshelves. Some young mages were sitting by the desk in 2s or 3s, each concentrating between a thick stack of books. Judging from the magical wave emanating from them, most of them were above level 6 or 7, but they were only in their 20s, and several of them were even younger than Lin Li. He reckoned that these were all young talents specially trained by the Alana Guild of Magic. Lin Li walked gently into the hall. After circling around in the middle of a row of bookshelves, he quickly found what he wanted. It was a thread-bound book with a black cover. What was recorded in it was not a magic spell, but a biography written by a bard based on hearsay after the Dark Ages. It included the life of High Lord Osric. In the hall on the first floor of the Omniscient Tower, besides a variety of low-level spells, the most common books were probably these anecdotes. It was just that this light read was obviously less popular than low-level magic spells. Just like the one in Lin Li's hands, when it was picked up and shaken lightly, the thick dust on the cover was shaken off. It was probably some years since anyone had last picked it up to read. Lin Li did not care. He shook the dust off the cover, and casually took a seat at the desk. He was even reading the biography with great interest. Anyway, he had never thought about looking for any spells coming to the Omniscient Tower today. It was almost evening when they had returned from the Shadow Glen, and he was still asked by the two old fellows to forge a weapon. He had also spent a lot of time on the bolts when he returned to the dormitory. By the time they reached the Omniscient Tower after passing through the various checkpoints, it was already time for the largest magic treasure house in Felon to close. It was too late to memorize even if they had found some powerful spells at this time. He'd rather find some light reading on the first floor to pass time and learn more about High Lord Osric while at that. Speaking of the High Lord, Lin Li was very intrigued indeed. Since arriving in Alana, Lin Li felt as if he was always involved with the High Lord. Osric's name was clearly written on the two rags written in High Elf's language. The Torrent of Elements ring on his hand was also said to have been the ring worn by the High Lord during his lifetime. Even these days, Lin Li was treated with courtesy at the Alana Guild of Magic because he could help them win the key to Osric's mausoleum. He had nothing to do, anyway. It'd be good to know more about it. Lin Li read the biography with great interest with such an idea in mind. Savage, Osric's biography was full of legendary quality, and with the bard's exaggerated writing, Lin Li was utterly stunned as he read. Speaking of High Lord Osric, one had to mention the conflicting clan of the High Elves. After the remote years of floods and wilderness, after the Titans and dragons disappeared in the long history, the High Elves took advantage of this opportunity to rise, and began to rule Amril with blood and magic for thousands of years. Compared with other clans, the High Elves could be described as perfect. No one could match their superiority in magic. Every adult High Elf possessed at least the strength of an archmage. With this unique advantage, the High Elves had almost advanced to the edge of magic civilization. They had created one miracle after another with magic. Even 1,200 years later, no clan had the guts to say that its magical achievements were anywhere near that unprecedented glorious civilization. In the mouth of most bards, the magic civilization created by the High Elves was described as a miracle beyond the gods. They loved and worshipped all things that were perfect, and their achievements in the field of art were equally amazing. Unfortunately, most of these achievements were destroyed by wars after the Dark Ages. Today, people could barely recover a trace of perfection from the ruins of High Elves. At the same time, they were a clan full of contradictions. When dealing with other clans, the brutality of the High Elves had reached an appalling level. In their eyes, other clans were just inferior creatures, whose only purpose was to serve as slaves. When dealing with other clans, the High Elves did not even consider hypocritical appeasement, but only the most direct and brutal enslavement. The orcs had tried to resist, but what awaited them was the repression of blood and fire. 6 months later, millions of orcs from 18 clans died under the butcher knives of the Magic Legion. Nearly every village was covered with the hanging corpses of the orcs. Millions of orcs had groaned and wailed under the butcher knives, and blood stained large areas of land red. High Lord Osric was undoubtedly a typical example of a high elf. Even in that glorious age of magic civilization, Osric's strength was absolutely the highest. He had even fought with the god of mages, Juresco. According to the bard's description, in the war at the end of the Dark Ages, the rebels sent their strongest fighters, 7 strong men of the legendary level, to assassinate Osric. They successfully infiltrated the palace of the High Lord, coming face to face with the real ruler of the Felon Kingdom, High Lord Osric. Eventually, none of them escaped, and the 7 legendary strongmen remained in the High Lord's palace forever. Osric merely said a few words about it. "Kill those loathsome bugs." Then, there was the infamous massacre, the most well-known event in Osric's life. 100,000 rebels were hanged overnight. This horrible massacre also earned him the nickname, the Butcher. But, few people knew that in addition to this massacre, Osric had actually done a lot of things in his life. The legendary life of Osric almost perfectly illustrated the conflicting nature of the High Elves. Behind the cruel nickname of the Butcher, he was also a wise scholar with profound knowledge, a powerful mage, a versatile craftsman, and a famous artist. Osric, shrouded by numerous halos, could only be described as amazing. At the end of the Dark Age, the High Elves laid the foundation of pharmaceutical theory and developed the complete framework of pharmaceutics on the basis of this theory. High Lord Osric was a real potion master. In the description of the bard, Osric's pharmaceutics level was exaggerated to an incredible degree. All sorts of magical potions had rendered Lin Li dumbfounded. In particular, the biography mentions several rare formulas Osric had discovered in his later years. Even Lin Li, a pharmaceutics guru, had only heard about them. In his later years, Osric became interested in forging. So, he led the Magic Legion and conquered the Dark Iron Dwarves. Countless Dark Iron Dwarf craftsmen were sent to Osric's palace to demonstrate forging techniques for him day and night. It took less than a year for the High Lord to make amazing progress in the field of forging. 4 of the 7 most notable pieces of magical equipment in the Felon Kingdom today came from High Lord Osric. Osric's life was full of legendary quality, especially after 1,200 years. Looking back on his life, it really felt like reading a novel, but the satisfying kind of novel where the main character was invincible. Lin Li felt satisfied reading it. However, after the satisfaction, he looked back, and suddenly realized that there was not even a trace of the thing that he wanted to find. That day in the Shadowglen, the Lich's mention of the Butcher's Ring almost caused Lin Li to encounter the Bite of Mana. At that time, he had vaguely guessed that the Torrent of Elements ring on his hand was most likely related to the High Elf's High Lord. The reason why he stayed in the hall on the first floor was not only to find some light red to pass time, but also to see if he could find some clues about the Torrent of Elements from Osric's life story. Unfortunately, nothing was found. Lin Li shook his head and closed the thread-bound book again. He was about to stand up and put it back on the shelf when, suddenly, he heard light footsteps behind him. "How did you come here?" Lin Li looked back and found that it was his 2 teammates. "We've copied a couple of spells and came to call you back together." "I say, Felix, what on earth were you reading to be so fascinated?" Mason pulled a chair furiously and sat down on Lin Li's right. The sound of a fuss prompted several young mages who were reading to glare at him. "Idiot, keep your voice down." Orin glared at him. The fellow was always so overjoyed that he forgot his surname. Could he make a lot of noise in a place like the Omniscient Tower? It would be trouble if they attracted the attention of the Archmage outside the door. Ooh, Mason remembered where he was after being stared at by several young mages. He nodded his head, but his eyes fell on the thread-bound book. Bloody hell, after so long, you're looking at this stuff? Felix, is it necessary for you to come to the Omniscient Tower for something that you could get with a few silver coins on the street? I had nothing to do anyway. Lin Li looked at the sky. It was almost time for the Omniscient Tower to close. He got up and put the thread-bound book back on the bookshelf. Then, he left the hall with his two teammates. As they exited the gate of the Omniscient Tower, Lin Li asked, "How's the harvest?" "Haha, the harvest is too great." Mason's face was filled with excitement at the mention of the harvest in the Omniscient Tower. Without waiting for Lin Li to ask further, he began to talk in full swing. "I've copied down 2 level 10 spells and 1 level 12 spell." This, Lin Li scratched his head, and asked in doubt, "Can you use it?" "I'm a genius. It doesn't matter if I can't use now. After a year and a half, maybe I can even use a level 15 spell." When Mason finished, he looked around furtively, then lowered his voice and said, "Besides, even if I can't use it, other people can always use it. I can take them back to Chaban City." Lin Li listened to this and suddenly understood that it was no wonder the tower was like a military restricted area. All access needed to be certified and all kinds of annoying rules were laid down. It was all because there were many people like Mason. However, it didn't seem to be a violation of the rules. Anyway, when the Alana Guild of Magic approved them coming to the Omniscient Tower, they had most probably thought about this. He should also copy some the next day. That old fellow, Jirian, would probably be spoiled with delight when Lin Li brought it back to Jirosis when the time came. Lin Li was turning things over in his mind as he crossed the lawn with his teammates. They walked along the corridors all the way back to the guild hall. As soon as the three of them entered the guild hall, Mason pulled Lin Li's sleeves from behind, and said, "Felix, look over there." "Look at what?" Lin Li was taken aback. "To your right, quick, look." "How come it's this guy?" Lin Li looked in the direction that Mason said and immediately saw a familiar figure, a fellow in his 20s, tall, handsome, and dressed in a well-tailored blue mage robe. His appearance seemed to be in line with a lady's standards of Prince Charming. It was a pity that he walked with a limp, making people feel uncomfortable when watching. "Matthias," Lin Li was somewhat surprised. He knew very well the strength of his strikes. When the 4 arcane missiles went down, Lin Li knew that this guy would probably be bedridden until the end of the trial. It had only been 10 days, and the fellow could walk already. Was he not merciless enough at the beginning? "I didn't expect this guy to be able to walk so fast." Mason was also surprised. "He won't be able to walk again soon." Oren's eyes were fixed on Matthias, who was still in the distance. The dense chill in his voice seemed to freeze even the air. With Oren's character, how could he possibly forget the incident back then? It was probably the first blow that Oren suffered after coming to Alana. He had always been very proud. Apart from Gryffindor, no other young mages were worthy of his attention. Although there was Felix, he was a monster, and could not be measured by human standards. But, Matthias' sneak attack was always on his mind. Now that he had run into him in the guild hall, how could Oren let him off that easily? "Felix, I've got something to discuss with you." Oren, who never asked for help, had used the word discuss for the very first time today. "Don't worry, I won't interfere." Lin Li did not even have to ask, he knew what Oren wanted to do. After receiving the fireball with his body that day, Lin Li knew he had guessed wrong. Matthias' strength could never be above Oren's. The reason why Oren was injured was probably due to a sneak attack. Lin Li wasn't worried at all now that Oren wanted to finish off by himself. So, he coolly agreed to it. "Thanks." In the meantime, Matthias discovered the 3 figures. This was perhaps what meeting enemies opens new wounds meant. Matthias looked at the 3 men as if he were going to eat them. His fists were tightly clenched. From a distance away, Lin Li seemed to be able to see the bulging green veins on his forehead. But, Matthias quickly smiled. Mason rubbed his eyes to make sure that he was not wrong. The guy was really smiling, and he was smiling very brightly, such that Mason thought he had seen a ghost. He subconsciously poked Lin Li, who was beside him, with his hand. Felix, do you think that guy's so mad he's become neurotic? Maybe he was scared into it, Lin Li responded irresponsibly. In fact, he was puzzled as well. From Matthias' words and deeds, Lin Li could tell that he was not someone that easy to dismiss. Lin Li did not believe that Matthias was someone who would meet enmity and smile. Had he really become neurotic from the scare, seeing how brilliantly he was smiling? I can't believe that you all are still alive. Just as the three of them were wondering, Matthias limped towards them, the smile still on his slightly pale face. But, in Lin Li's opinion, the smile was exceptionally uncomfortable to watch. It was like when old Merlin was smiling at Jirian. He was obviously so furious that he could vomit blood, but he was still putting up a smile on his face. It was unbelievably fake. I say, Matthias, can you stop smiling so fakely? There are no outsiders here. Everyone knows I've broken your limbs. Take it easy, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Lin Li was an honest man, he'd always say anything that was on his mind. But, being too honest often hurt other people. Matthias almost couldn't catch his breath. The smile he had tried so hard to squeeze out was distorted immediately. Matthias, listen to my advice. It's better for a disabled man to cleanse his heart and limit his inner desires. Don't worry too much about things like whether we could come back alive or not. It'll affect your recovery. Lin Li spoke with sincerity as if he was really concerned for an old friend. What did you say? After all, Matthias was only in his 20s. How could he stand this kind of provocation? His hands were tightly held into fists, and fire seemed to be bursting from his eyes. Look, you're agitated again. How could Matthias rival Lin Li in eloquence? Matthias had only spoken a few words, and he was already trembling in agitation. But, then again, according to Lin Li's character, how could he possibly have said so much to Matthias? As early as when the latter came to incite them, Lin Li would have delivered a fireball straight to him. Would he be crapping so much with Matthias? What crap? Half the reason for wasting so much saliva was for Oren. Lin Li actually couldn't wait for Matthias to pounce on him after provoking him with a sincere face. Then, he would run on him a few words and drive him into a fair duel with Oren. It'd be considered fulfilling Oren's wish. However, Matthias seemed to be behaving a little out of the ordinary today. This fellow had to have taken the wrong medicine. He was still glaring angrily with his fists clenched a moment ago, but he relaxed very quickly, and even put on a fake smile on his face. Forget it. It doesn't make sense to be angry with a country bumpkin like you. Having said that, Matthias leaned close to Lin Li's ear and said in a low voice, however, you must be careful not to make yourself become like me. What? How could such a threat frighten Lin Li? He looked at Matthias in surprise, and raised his voice so much that half of the hall could hear him. Mage, Matthias, did you say you are impotent? Oh my God, that's terrible. Almost half of the guild hall was attracted by this exclamation. At least dozens of mages looked towards them at the same time. Under the sympathetic eyes of the mages, Matthias was flushed as he told himself, endure, endure. Matthias' psychological endurance seemed to have improved a lot. Was it because he had spent a few days lying down? Lin Li was treading all over his face with his provocations, but he had swallowed it all down. Apart from his increasingly unsightly face, he had no intention of doing anything at all. Lin Li was more or less surprised by it. He wanted to continue provoking him, forcing him into a duel with Oren. However, he let it go at that. Such a trifle was not enough to affect Lin Li's mood. For the next few days, he was cooped up in the Omniscient Tower, reading with relish with a thick stack of books every day. But, unlike his two teammates, Lin Li had never gone above the 3rd floor of the Omniscient Tower over the past few days. He had been cramming with a group of young mages, holding either books on basic skills or basic theories, perplexing his two teammates. Mason really couldn't figure out what this guy was really thinking. He was clearly at the peak of magic shooters, but he wouldn't go above the 10th floor to learn the more powerful spells. On the contrary, he was nestled on the 1st and 2nd floor every day, reading these apprentice-level books with great interest. What kind of mentality was it? Can apprenticeship be addictive? In the face of such question, Lin Li did not know how to explain for a while. His situation was too special. It took him less than half a year to go from an apprentice to a magic shooter. Even if Lin Li was strongly gifted, it would inevitably leave some drawbacks. It was like traveling. If you were in a hurry, you would always miss some roadside scenery. That was the case for Lin Li now. Because his progress was so fast, he had missed a lot of things. He knew the principle of spellcasting and its techniques, but when it came to the most detailed places, Lin Li would immediately expose his shortcomings. It had nothing to do with talent nor diligence, it was simply because he lacked adequate personal experience. Such was magic. Apart from talent and diligence, patience and time were also needed. Even for the worst mage, as long as he was willing to try 10 million times, he'd naturally grasp every detail of a spell. What Lin Li lacked now was precisely this kind of details. Fortunately, he had gained the right to enter and exit the omniscient tower freely. What the largest magic treasure house in the whole of Felon Kingdom had the most were reading notes describing such details. Almost as soon as he got these reading notes, Lin Li realized that this was what he needed most. For the next few days, he immersed himself in these reading notes almost every day. It took him nearly 10 days to go through the first to the third floor of the omniscient tower. In the same time, Mason had copied 10 high-level spells, and Oren had broken through the limit to reach the rank of a level 12 magic shooter. But, Lin Li didn't think he was wasting his time. On the contrary, he thought it meaningful, for he could clearly feel that he was making rapid progress every day. He seemed to find the answers to a lot of questions he did not understand, and what gave him the answers was often a tittle-tattle on the reading notes. The person who wrote these reading notes might be a famous gifted mage in Amril, or a mage apprentice who could not break through level 5 all his life. When they wrote these reading notes, they might not even think that it could provide an answer to some questions. But, when Lin Li saw these reading notes, there was always a feeling of sudden enlightenment, as if he had found a thread in a mess. With a light stroke, he had untangled numerous knots. This feeling of being suddenly enlightened caused Lin Li to be immersed in pleasant reading all the time. It wasn't until the 10th day that Lin Li suddenly remembered he still had a lot to do. That morning, instead of going to the omniscient tower with his 2 teammates, he left the guild hall, and went to the equipment store on the corner. "Good morning, boss." "Good morning, good morning. I didn't expect to see you again so soon, Mr. Mage." The boss obviously remembered Lin Li. For any businessman, they'd perhaps not forget a big spender who once spent hundreds of thousands of gold coins in his store. Moreover, this big spender was such a unique one. "Boss, can I ask, has the person who sold those 2 pieces of equipment been here recently?" "Once." The middle-aged boss nodded his head. He remembered it very well. After all, the deal impressed him deeply. After carefully recalling, the middle-aged boss continued, "It seems like 15 days ago, when he came to collect the money, I've asked him to go to the Guild of Magic to look for you. Why did he not look for you?" No wonder. Lin Li counted the days. 10 days ago, he was in the Shadow Glen, completing his trial mission. It would be strange if the seller could find him at that time. It was a pity. He had finally found a clue, but it was lost due to a coincidence. Without the fire salamandered skin, it would not be so easy to go to the Fire Plume Ridge to gather the Black Lotus. Surely it couldn't be that he really had to use the Black Dragon skin? Fire immunity was not a problem at all if the Black Dragon skin was used. After all, it was what the Dragon of Destruction left behind. He could wear it to Fire Plume Ridge after a simple treatment process. But, the problem was that Lin Li hated to use it. The Black Dragon skin was no less valuable than the Black Lotus. Perhaps there was no one who could make the Black Dragon skin into an armor so casually. Lin Li wanted to never use that batch of Black Dragon skin before he came up with a perfect treatment process. Oh, right. Just when Lin Li was vacillating, the middle-aged boss suddenly said, "He seemed to have said that he will come again in a few days, and then he will send 2 other pieces of equipment to me to be put up for sale." "Oh?" Hearing this, Lin Li hurriedly asked, "When?" The middle-aged boss thought for a moment before he replied affirmatively, the day after tomorrow. Thank you so much, Lin Li was relieved. After thanking the middle-aged boss, he asked, oh yes, boss, do you help in smelting or here? What Lin Li wanted to smelt were precisely the eternal adamantine in the ring of endless storm. It was not because he couldn't smelt it himself. As a master of mineral veins, smelting ore was the most basic skill. But, it was unlike pharmaceutics, where he could make a few beakers or test tubes, and could control his mana accurately such that he could concoct many potions even in the wild. Smelting required some professional equipment, including blast furnace, hot air stoves, and so on, which was enough to make Lin Li's head pound. He was living in the Alana Guild of Magic at present. If he really were to get a large number of professional equipment, then not to mention that it would frighten other mages, perhaps even Aldwin would be alarmed. Smelting ore? Surely not in the store, but I have a smelting workshop in the north of the city. If you can trust me, you can give me the ore. When I have finished the smelting, you can come back and get it. Okay, I'll bring you the ore later, Lin Li agreed very coolly. He had nothing to worry about with this regular businessman. Others could consign hundreds of thousands of worth in equipment here. To some extent, it could also prove the credibility of the middle-aged boss. By the way, boss, the ore I want to smelt may be more troublesome. You can charge a higher price, but you must guarantee the quality of smelting. May I know what ore are you planning to smelt? This is it, Lin Li reached into his pocket and fumbled in it. He pulled out a piece of eternal adamantine that he had long prepared. The middle-aged owner took the ore in his hand and looked at it carefully for a long time before he asked with great difficulty, this. Isn't it eternal adamantine? Yes, it's eternal adamantine. The middle-aged boss probably had never handled such expensive ore before. The hand that was holding the ore was trembling a little. After hesitation, he finally bit his teeth and said, okay, you can bring the ore here in the afternoon. I'll start work this afternoon. You can pick it up tomorrow. As for the price, the middle-aged boss said in one breath, and thought again. I usually collect 1,000 gold coins for each time I run the furnace, but it's really too precious, so my risk is relatively high. I tell you what, I will collect 3,000 gold coins from you, okay? No problem. By the way, Mr. Mage, how many eternal adamantine do you have in your hands? About 2 carriages. Before leaving, Lin Li seemed to hear a clatter. It sounded as if someone had fallen down. After coming out of the equipment store, Lin Li went directly to the Alana garage, where he hired 2 carriages, and then took them around the city of Alana. Finally, he found a quiet place, opened the ring of endless storm, and poured the eternal adamantine down on the ground. After that, it was loaded and transported off. It took a whole morning for Lin Li to complete this trip. He handed 3,000 gold coins to the middle-aged boss, and then watched him transport the 2 cars of eternal adamantine to the north of the city. Lin Li finally breathed a long sigh. This morning was really troublesome. But, he couldn't stay idle because he had one more thing to do. After returning to the Guild of Magic, Lin Li went directly to the spell testing hall. This was probably the difference between a small town and a big city. If it were the Gerosis Guild of Magic, spell testing would probably be arranged in the level certification hall, because there was also a magical shield field and the elements annihilation field, as well as a crystal ball to test the strength of the spell. In addition to certifying the level, it could also be used for spell testing. In Jirian's words, this was called thrifty housekeeping, spending as little as possible where you could. But, this was the Alana Guild of Magic, the heart of all magic in the Felon Kingdom. It was the purpose of the Alana Guild of Magic to seek not the best, but the most expensive, regardless of the kind of money that was spent. The spell testing hall was on the 4th floor. Lin Li easily obtained a private room with his identity as a trial mage. The room was empty, with only one crystal ball, 4 mageweths, a magical shield field, and an elements annihilation field inside. Each of them had 2 channels, which were used to protect the structure of the room and crystal ball used for the test, respectively. Lin Li looked at the structure of these two magewets to ensure that they could withstand the bombardment of a magic shooter-level spell. Then, he opened the Ring of Endless Storm in relief, and pulled out the fist-sized dragon's eye from it. This was the first time Lin Li had taken it out since he came back from the Nightmare Mountains. When he came out of the cave that night, he had witnessed the battle between the mercenary corp and a shapeshifter, followed by the appearance of the strange crystal. After returning to Alana, he had to go for the trial in the Shadow Glen arranged by the Supreme Council. He had finally completed the trial mission, but had been immersing himself in the Omniscient Tower every day. He had gotten the dragon's eye for more than half a month, but he still did not know the spell it contained. This was simply unthinkable for a researcher such as Lin Li. Anyway, he didn't have to go to the Omniscient Tower today, so he took out the dragon's eye and studied it. In order to ensure his own safety, Lin Li had deliberately took a few steps back. After all, no one knew what kind of spell this dragon's eye contained. In case it was a powerful spell that could cover a large area, he might get injured if he stood too close to it. Lin Li did not stop until he retreated to the door. He tightened his grip on the dragon's eye in his hand, and began a slow and steady mana input. With a trace of mana pouring into the dragon's eye, Lin Li could clearly see that the unique orange glow of the dragon's eye was gradually becoming brighter and brighter, especially when Lin Li's mana input was about to break through the limit. This orange light seemed to become golden in a flash. At a glance, it looked as if the room was covered in gold foil. The room was filled with a golden light, so resplendent that it made one dizzy. When the golden light reached its peak, the room suddenly set off a surge of magical wave. The mass of mana seemed to solidify all of a sudden. Even Lin Li could not help feeling a huge pressure. But, after that, it was dead silent. Nothing had happened. Lin Li rubbed his eyes and looked at the dragon's eye in his hand. He thought it had to be an illusion. A long time later, there was a loud cry in the room. F***ck. How could this be possible? Lin Li almost went mad on the spot. How could that be possible? Earlier on, he had clearly felt the mana that was concealed in Dragon's Eye had been activated by his own mana. Even a fool could feel the turbulent magical wave and that enormous pressure. However, after that, there was not even any reaction from the crystal ball at all. What was this situation? Lin Li refused to give up, and circled around the crystal ball again. Yes, there was no response at all. What is this? The dragon's eye in his hand was blasted out of the eternal adamantine vein, and it was a piece as big as a fist. Even if it was dead, it should at least contain a spell. How could it be that there was no movement at all, like this? It was all too fake. Back in the endless world, Lin Li did see some discarded dragon's eyes before. It didn't seem to look any different, but after inputting mana into it, it couldn't even release a wind blade, which was the lowest level of spell. However, those dragon's eyes were either too small to contain a spell, or mistakes were made during mining, dealing considerable damage to the internal structure of the dragon's eye and directly causing the spell concealed in them to disappear. There was no doubt that neither of these two situations had something to do with the one in his hand. There was no need to mention it being too small. It was the size of a fist, and could even crush someone to death, much less contain a spell in it. As for damaging the internal structure, it was equally impossible. A thoroughly destroyed dragon's eye would not react to mana at all. It was essentially a stone. How could it emit that gorgeous golden light under the drive of mana? I'll fight with you. Lin Li refused to be misled by fallacies. After pondering over and over for half a day, he found that he really couldn't figure it out. He simply held the dragon's eye tightly, and began to input mana into it desperately. He wouldn't talk about reason anymore. He'd need to replenish his mana every time he used it, right? He'd just replenish it. Anyway, he had an almost infinite mana. If once wasn't enough, he'd just try several times. He would spend the whole day on multiple attempts. He did not believe that he wouldn't be able to discern it. Under the immense profusion of mana, the faint orange light soon emerged on the dragon's eye, which had just exhausted its mana. Lin Li took a few steps back after the mana was replenished. With the previous experience, he no longer had to control his output as slowly as before, but directly enhanced the mana to its limit. In an instant, another dazzling golden light veiled the room. Then, the dragon's eye was still the dragon's eye, and the crystal ball was still the crystal ball, both were similarly dim and dull. As before, nothing had changed. Fuck. Lin Li banged his head on the wall. Just as he was about to replenish another round of mana, Lin Li suddenly noticed something unusual. Wrong. This time, he finally realized what was wrong. As the golden light of the dragon's eye dissipated, there was no trace of magical wave in the room. This was a place where spell tests were conducted, and there was no magical wave at all. It was something quite weird in itself. Whether it was the 4 mages in the room or the crystal ball that was bombarded with spells all year round, both should show a trace of magical wave in any case. How could it be like this? Even a little bit of magical wave could not be felt. Lin Li himself was a master of inscription. He was all too familiar with the 2 mages in the room. Neither the magical shield field nor the element's annihilation field had the effect of concealing magical wave. Moreover, the 2 mages needed to be supplied with mana to maintain their normal functions. They themselves would emit a subtle magical wave. How could they be like this? What's the situation again? Lin Li scratched his head, looking more bewildered than before. Lin Li mulled it over and over, but still couldn't find an answer to it. So, he decided to take a dumber approach. Of course, he couldn't do it alone. He had to ask Macklin for help. Lin Li put the dragon's eye back into the ring of endless storm, and hurried out of the spell-testing hall. He took the stairs all the way to the 2nd floor, and soon found Macklin's room. Knock, knock, knock. He had just knocked at the door a few times when he heard Macklin's angry roar, coming from the room. Who the fuck is being so inconsiderate, disrupting my rest early in the morning? Mr. Macklin, this is Felix. Lin Li jumped in shock. Had the old man taken gunpowder? What time was it already to be early in the morning? Why didn't he just say middle of the night? Oh. So, it's you, kid. Come in. The door's not locked. Lin Li pushed open the door and went in. He saw Macklin sitting there in a rather uncultured position. One of his feet was on the table. After Lin Li entered the room, he found that there was another acquaintance sitting inside, besides Macklin. Good afternoon, Mr. Darien, Lin Li greeted with a smile. Perhaps few people could imagine, seeing the expression on his face, that this polite-looking fellow was actually the culprit who had beaten Darien's nephew into a cripple. HNG. Darien snorted, his face as black as the bottom of a pan. The atmosphere in the room was full of tension, making Macklin's head throb. He rubbed the center of his forehead painfully, and quickly interrupted, "All right, Darien, I'll think about what you've said. You go back first." Yes, Mr. Macklin. Macklin had already spoken, so Darien would have to abide even if he was unwilling. In case he had incited the anger of the guild's most powerful archmage, it'd be too late to regret. Macklin was not as accommodating as Aldwin. He would always turn hostile all of a sudden, without even prior greeting. Darien got up and opened the door. Before he left, he shot a merciless glare at Lin Li. Let alone Lin Li, even Macklin, who was at his side, could clearly see the hatred in his eyes. It was just that Macklin was troubled now, and he pretended not to see it. Seeing Darien's figure disappear at the end of the corridor, Lin Li closed the door and shamelessly left the matter clean. I'm sorry to interrupt your discussion with Mr. Darien. Why bother pretending? You can't possibly not know what we're talking about. Macklin had a headache just looking at this guy. This kid was absolutely driving him to death. He had only been in Alana for slightly more than half a month, but had gotten into a butt of trouble. Matthias and Madrick were crippled one after another by him. During this period of time, Macklin had wanted to hit the wall with his head, just taking the blame for him. Just like facing Darien earlier on, Macklin had spent a lot of effort to barely pacify him. But, the pacification could only be temporary. Who knew when these two fellows would clash again? It would be trouble for Macklin when the time came. There could be no mishaps with Felix. Not to mention the bet with the Adventurers Guild 6 months later. The ability he had shown at present alone was sufficient for the Alana Guild of Magic to fight for. Let alone Darien. Even if His Majesty the King came, Macklin would never allow him to lay a hand on Felix. But, the problem was that there could not be any mishap with Darien either. He was an elder of the Alana Guild of Magic. Over the past few decades, he had long run a huge force in the guild. If something had happened to him, and it was because Felix, wouldn't the others raise the devil with the guild on the spot? In this respect, Macklin was not as good as Darien. Darien's hard work for decades had brought his personal prestige to the peak. The Gerosis Guild of Magic could be said to be his own guild. In the Gerosis Guild of Magic, his words were the truth, and no mage dared to defy him. However, even back then, when Darien had given Lin Li special privileges, there were voices of opposition as well, and he had even forced out 3 traitors as a result. If that was true for Darien, it naturally went without saying for Macklin, who was worse than him. And, some things could never be made public. After the long talk with Aldwin that day, the two men were surprisingly in agreement. Felix's real situation could not be made public. This kid was a freak. It was frightening just thinking about the various peculiar points of his. If the other forces were to know there was such a figure in the Alana Guild of Magic, perhaps it wouldn't take a few days for them to be hounded. Alana was such a place, they were more serious in robbing talents than robbing money. What forces wouldn't want to fight for a talent like Felix? This fellow had even gone beyond the scope of talent. If he were to be described in one word, it would probably only be all-rounder. He was proficient in both forging and pharmaceutics, and his talent in magic was enviably strong. It probably wouldn't take him long to reach the realm of an archmage. What forces would not want to contend for such an omnipotent young genius? The truth, this young genius's ability, could never be disclosed. So far, no one in the guild knew the truth except Aldwin and Macklin. In the eyes of ordinary people, this young man from Gerosis was merely a gifted trial mage. Maybe Mason and Oren knew something about it, but it was only something. After all, they were both too young to see anything beyond the surface. They certainly knew that their teammate was different, but they most likely did not know what this difference really meant. All these reasons distressed Macklin. Darien counted on his nephew's injury and his status as an elder. He knew that Macklin would not go too far with himself. The recent days had been a real storm. He came to Macklin every day, insisting that the Gerosis country boy would have to be severely dealt with. Macklin could only laugh bitterly in the face of Darien's demands. He really wanted to tell Darien, if it weren't for the Gerosis country boy you mentioned, the Alana Guild of Magic would be in trouble 6 months later. Unfortunately, these were the words that couldn't be uttered. So, Macklin could only suffer in silence as he listened to Darien's complaints while contemplating that he had to find a chance to banish the B*TCH to a remote and deserted place after this matter had passed. What is Mr. Darien demanding to do with me? Since Macklin had already said so, Lin Li was also too embarrassed to continue his pretense. There is no specific demand, but in general, it can all be summed up in 2 words, severely dealt. Lin Li chuckled, embarrassed. He knew that Macklin had to be under some pressure in this matter. After all, Darien was an elder in the guild. Macklin would have to spare some effort to suppress his opinions. However, it could not be helped. Some things were like that, knowing that doing it might cause trouble, many times it still had to be done. Just like Madrick the other day. Lin Li knew that Madrick was Darien's nephew and that Darien would never let him off easily after having crippled Madrick. But, Lin Li did not hesitate at all even up to the end, and the flaming hands fell without stopping. The reason why he did it was not so much to do justice for Sean, but rather to express an attitude. If he wanted to bite me, then he had to come to understand that he might be beaten to death. To Lin Li, this was a warning, but also a strategy. At the beginning, he did try to tolerate it. When he first arrived at Alana Guild of Magic, Darien's attitude was not particularly normal. At that time, Lin Li thought there had to be some misunderstanding. Then, he was reminded by Mason that Darien had deliberately not informed himself to report to the guild hall. Lin Li had marked it down in his heart, but he had always kept it in mind, and not spelled it out. It wasn't until the incident with Sean that Lin Li was finally infuriated. Since tolerance couldn't resolve the contradiction, he'd simply intensify it completely and put everything in the open. It might seem dangerous to outrage an archmage, but, in fact, it was much safer than letting him prey on himself in the dark. The aim was to let everyone know that Darien was in conflict with him. In this way, if Darien wanted to aim his shots at Lin Li, he'd have to think twice whether he'd get caught doing so. To let the enemy worry was the real preemptive strategy. But, don't worry too much about it. Aldwin and I will deal with it. Seeing Lin Li was silent, Macklin thought he was worried about something. After a few words of comfort, he asked Lin Li about his purpose today. Forget it, let's not talk about this. You've come to me today not just to see Darien, right? Oh, yeah, at his reminder, Lin Li recalled his main purpose. Mr. Macklin, can you do me a favor? What favor? Macklin suddenly became interested. For a long time, the kid had behaved like a freak. Macklin did not even feel that he needed help for a lifetime. It's like this. I acquired a gemstone a few days ago. As far as I know, there should be a spell in this gemstone, but I went to the spell testing hall just now and couldn't find out what kind of spell it was, so. I was thinking, could you help me to test it? The dragon's eye? With Macklin's knowledge, how could he not know what it was? Before Lin Li had finished speaking, he had already guessed what this gemstone was. Yes, dragon's eye. No problem, Macklin agreed coolly. Although the dragon's eye was precious, he had already seen many of it with his status. To tell the truth, he did not think much of this magical gemstone which was said to have been transformed from a dragon's eye. In his opinion, the power of this magical gemstone was too low. It could only contain stuff such as wind blade or icicle, which couldn't even break through the elemental shield. What practical significance does it hold? To test the power of the spell was as easy as eating and drinking for Macklin. Without even a second thought, he went straight into the spell testing hall with Lin Li. Come. Macklin erected an elemental shield with a wave of his staff. Oh, Lin Li nodded, and fished out the dragon's eye from his pocket. Damn. The fist-sized dragon's eye almost drove Macklin mad on the spot. The old man's eyes immediately became glazed when he saw the glistening yellow light. He'd never imagined that the dragon's eye in the kid's mouth was such a big fellow. F***ck. Macklin wanted to bang the wall. With his knowledge of dragon's eyes, how could he not know that the level of the spell contained in the dragon's eye was proportional to its volume? What the kid had in his hand was the size of a fist. The spell contained in it, was it a magic shooter level or an archmage level 1? Why, Mr. Macklin, is there some difficulty? Nonsense. What difficulty? You just try it. With Macklin's character, how could he admit that he was unconfident? Nevertheless, though he refused to admit outwardly, he dared not treat it lightly in his heart. He waved his staff again, and a spurt of flames rose. 4 burning fireballs whirled around Macklin, looking like 4 bright suns. This was the flame shield, a single attribute shield which one could possess after having attained the realm of an archmage. It was the same concept as the skeletal shield on the lich. Under the protection of 2 layers of shields, Macklin then retreated a step. He hardened his scalp, and murmured, "Okay, come on." Then, I won't stand on ceremony. Lin Li tightened his grip on the dragon's eye, and began his mana input in a slow yet steady manner. The orange light gradually became brighter under the impetus of the mana, and bit by bit, it started to display a gorgeous gold. Everything seemed to be the same as before. The golden light became brighter and more resplendent. It was like laying a layer of golden foil in the room. When the brilliant light reached its peak, a violent magical wave broke out. But, this time, the room was no longer dead silent. For Macklin had exclaimed all of a sudden. F***ck. What's wrong? Macklin's voice was like a stuck pig, and it startled Lin Li right on the spot. He couldn't care less about studying the change in the dragon's eye, and hurriedly went over to support Macklin. Mr. Macklin, are you all right? All right. Macklin shook his head, but his face was turning pale. Then, Lin Li wanted to ask what the situation was about when he felt that there was something wrong with Macklin. With this doubt in mind, he studied Macklin carefully for a long time before he finally understood what the problem was. The two shields that Macklin had just propped up had suddenly disappeared into thin air. Lin Li rubbed his eyes hard so that he could see even more clearly. He hadn't seen it wrong. Gone, all gone. Whether it was the colorful light on the elemental shield or the 4 fireballs around the flame shield, all of them had suddenly disappeared without trace. That's too fake, Lin Li stared at Macklin in dismay. For a moment, his eyes were straightened out. Macklin was someone close to the legendary level. The elemental and flame shield that he had propped up at the same time could almost withstand all strikes of the archmage level. Lin Li even felt that if someone like Aldwin had made the move personally, he might not even be able to break these two shields. However, everything before him was so real. It was true that someone broke the two shields in an instant. And that person was Lin Li himself. Lin Li completely lost his mind. He couldn't believe all this turned out to be true. That was the flame shield. Only after breaking through the realm of an archmage could one possess this specialized shield. It directly applied the power of the elemental source. Its defensive power had reached the point of almost abnormal. In addition to the flame shield, Macklin was also covered with a layer of elemental shield. Breaking the two shields at the same time almost meant that he had the opportunity to threaten a figure close to the legendary level in that very short period of time. There was no doubt that it was the dragon's eye that allowed him to break through the two shields. This is real? Fuck, duh, the old man cursed exasperatedly. He was really frightened just now. Macklin had never expected that there was such a perverted spell in this dragon's eye. How can this be? Although he had vaguely guessed something, Lin Li could not help but take in a cold breath upon hearing Macklin's admission. It really broke your shields just now? No, you can't say that. Macklin shook his head, and looked hesitant. In that case, interruption may be more appropriate. Why is it interruption? The reasons are complicated. If you want to make it clear, you need to know one thing first. Lin Li stood surprised. What is it? The thing is. Fuck, kid, you're too damn lucky, the old man cursed indignantly, and then went on saying, do you know what spell is hidden in this dragon's eye? No, I don't. If I remember correctly, this spell should be called the Arcane Wall, a level 15 spell that has been lost for 1,200 years. Make a guess. How formidable do you think this spell is? How can I guess? Lin Li shook his head numbly. He suddenly realized that he had shaken his head more times in a day than all the previous months combined. The old man laughed, and then went on to say, this magic is powerful in that it can cut off mana in an instant. To some extent, it is similar to mana retroaction, but mana retroaction is achieved by suppression. At the same time as interrupting the spell, it also has an anti-mana effect. On the contrary, Arcane Wall is achieved by cutting off mana, which will not produce the anti-mana effect. It can only cut off the circulation of mana temporarily. Isn't that another mana retroaction? Wrong. Macklin shook his head. There is a most obvious difference between these two spells. Mana retroaction can interrupt the recitation of spells, while Arcane Wall can at most prolong the duration of recitation. Its real use is against channel and semi-channel spells. Lin Li nodded, he really understood it this time. The so-called channel spells referred to spells that required a continuous output of mana in the process of spellcasting. For example, there were 12 arcane missile in total. In the process of releasing the 12 arcane missile, it was necessary to maintain a state of spellcasting all the time. Once interrupted, it would be impossible to release all 12 arcane missile at once. Semi-channel spells referred to spells such as the elemental shield. There was no need to maintain a spellcasting state, nor to use the mental strength to channel. When using semi-channel spells, the spellcaster was required to continue the provision of mana. If the mana output was interrupted, the elemental shield would naturally disappear. Does that mean that I can interrupt anyone's mana at will in future battles so as to achieve the effect of breaking through magic shields? No, no, no. you're wrong again. Macklin shook his head. Ah? Arcane wall doesn't work that way. First of all, you have to be clear that the arcane wall is not a mana retroaction. It lasts too shortly, and does not produce an anti-mana effect. When mana is interrupted, it would only take a moment to recover. What can you do in that moment? Not to mention recite a spell, you may not even be able to unleash an instantaneous spell. Then what's the significance of this arcane wall? In the Dark Ages, the arcane wall was a spell that every member of the Magic Legion had to master. Don't underestimate the interruption of a moment. During the war at that time, few people had the guts to release channel spells in front of the members of the Magic Legion. Do you know why? It's precisely because of the existence of the arcane wall. That exaggerated? Lin Li frowned. To be honest, he was incredulous. If, as Macklin said, the effect lasted only for a moment, what significance did it hold to interrupt the channel spells? Fool! Macklin glared at him fiercely. Don't you know that interruption could bring about the bite of mana? After being chided by Macklin, Lin Li suddenly remembered that forcibly interrupting the casting of a spell could bring about the bite of mana. In particular, for some channel spells, because they had to focus their attention on casting, once interrupted, it would likely result in mental confusion. The battle between mages was rapidly changing, and there was absolutely no room for a single mistake. It would only take one bite of mana to turn the game around. Moreover, it might result in mental confusion, which was much more powerful than the bite of mana. The severity ranged from loss of mana control to schizophrenia. At the end of the conversation, Macklin concluded with a sentence, "So, kid, you are really lucky this time. Put it away properly. If you use it right, you may even have a chance to defeat an archmage." The mage Lin Li nodded, and carefully put Dragon's Eye in his pocket. "Knowing that you have this thing, I feel more at ease." As Macklin spoke, he opened the closed door and came out of the spelling testing hall, his aged face filled with triumphant smile. "At least you don't have to worry about that fellow, Darien, anymore. He loves to use channel spells. When the time comes, you can use this gemstone to give him a big surprise. Damn it, I've been unhappy with this idiot for a long time. If he really comes to find trouble with you, don't need to give me face at all, beat him as hard as you can. I'd like to see if he still has the face to stay in Alana after being beaten by a magic shooter." It was unknown whether Darien could stay or not, but there was one person who certainly couldn't. His name was Matthias. Lin Li had been running to the Omniscient Tower every day over the past 10 days. Although he had not been there today, he was too busy to notice that the words he had used to tease Matthias had gradually spread in the Alana Guild of Magic. "Let me tell you a secret." "What secret?" "Do you know Matthias from Sunrise City? I heard that he's impotent." "Fuck. That exciting?" "Yes, yes. Pity Sir Wilhelm, he finally has a son, but he turns out to be impotent. Sigh, it's a tragedy indeed. You're the only person I told this secret to. You'll have to help me keep it, and not tell anyone else about it." No problem. Let me tell you a secret." "What secret?" "Do you know Matthias from Sunrise City? I heard he likes men instead of women." "Fuck. That exciting?" "Yes, yes. Pity Sir Wilhelm. He finally has a son, but it turns out that he likes men, and not women. Sigh, it's a tragedy indeed. You're the only person I told this secret to. You'll have to help me keep it, and not tell anyone else about it." No problem. Rumors were like plague, it would only spread faster and wider. From impotence to liking only men and not women, then to STD and body stench, it took only 4 to 5 days for such a complex process to evolve, and it seemed that there was a trend of it getting worse. As for the authenticity of the rumor, no one was willing to care about it. In fact, everyone knew that this was false. But, for them, the truth was not important. What was important was the satisfaction and pleasure in the process of spreading the rumor. So, it was unfortunate for Matthias. Damn it. Damn. Damn. damn it. Matthias' face was as black as the bottom of a pot. He was desperately smashing things to vent his anger. Everything that could be smashed in the room had already been smashed by him, but his rage only grew stronger and stronger. If possible, he really wanted to capture the Gerosis country boy right away and torture him for 10 days and 10 nights with the cruelest means so that he could die in endless pain after he had shed his last drop of blood. It was because of this darned guy that he had become the laughingstock of all people. Just listen to what they were saying. Matthias had been recovering recently, but the jokes circulating in the guild had passed through his ears without miss. Matthias felt as if he was on pins and needles listening to all the comments every day. He couldn't live another day like this anymore. That Gerosis country boy, he'd have to pay for everything he had done. Matthias slammed open the door. He dragged his wounded legs, that had yet to fully recover, planning to look for that darned fellow. However, he had just opened the door when he saw a figure in black robe standing outside the door. Matthias, what are you doing? Mentor Aaron, Matthias froze, then stammered a few times before finally continuing, I want to go out for a walk. Walk? Aaron looked at him, and a sneer appeared on his squarish face. I'm afraid you're going to see that Gerosis mage named Felek? Having been exposed by Aaron, Matthias was more or less pricked with guilt. All along, Aaron had given him an unfathomable feeling. Matthias was afraid of him, but he also respected him. All right, go if you want. Ah? Matthias gave a start of astonishment. But, I'll tell you, Matthias, if you have your limbs broken by him again this time, don't expect me to take out the restorative potion to save you. You'd better think it through. But. Mentor Aaron. But what? Aaron looked at him, his squarish face was still calm. It was impossible to figure what his mood was. But I can't swallow this down. What about that? Aaron sneered, his eyes fixed on Matthias. You can't swallow it, but what can you do with him? Do you think you're his match? I was only careless the last time, although Aaron's stare made him nervous. Matthias did not give in. During those 10 days in bed, he had thought over and over again, gradually finding out the crux of the battle. In this world, it was absolutely impossible for anyone to withstand a fireball without magical shield. Even a legendary mage would not be able to bear it. It was not something that could be endured with physical strength at all, unless that fellow named Felek was wearing some magical equipment. Matthias could even guess that the use of this magical equipment would most likely produce a similar effect to a magical shield. The fireball that he'd fired at that time must have been blocked by this magical equipment. This was exceptionally important. It was the magical equipment that had blocked the fireball, not the strength of the fellow himself. Matthias believed he couldn't be mistaken. The Gerosis country boy's strength would never exceed level 7. Even if he had made new breakthroughs in the past dozen days, it would never be beyond that of level 10. As long as he knew the real strength of his opponent, with his strength of a level 12 magic shooter, how could he be making the same mistakes again? It was also because of this that Matthias never understood why Mentor Aaron had asked him to endure. Endure. He wondered how long he'd have to endure. A moment of carelessness? Ha ha ha, Aaron seemed to have heard some funny joke when Matthias' words fell into his ears. After a long laugh, Aaron said to Matthias with sarcasm, You should thank yourself for your carelessness. Mentor Aaron, why is that? Matthias was a little guilty, being laughed at. Why? Aaron looked at him, his face was still full of derision. Matthias, you're not really so naive, are you? Do you really think that the Gerosis mage named Felek was only at the strength of level 7? Was he not? Matthias, you are so naive that I want to laugh. Aaron snickered derisively and continued until Matthias was rather insecure. Then, he shrugged his shoulders, and said indifferently, All right. Matthias, just treat it as he's a level 7 mage, but, what about that? Do you think Macklin will allow you to hurt his disciple? At the mention of this, let alone Matthias, even Aaron himself was somewhat discouraged. There was one thing he had not told Matthias, because he feared that it would frighten him completely. The so-called level 7 mage not only had the backing of Macklin, but also of a legendary mage named Anduin. After returning from the Nightmare Mountains that day, Eren had said nothing to anyone, and even forbade the 2 trial mages from speaking of that day again. In order to lull Macklin, he even pretended to have forgotten about it. But Eren remembered everything clearly in his heart. The person who hurt Bathriller had to pay the price. Eren was only tolerating. Eren knew he had made a mistake. It was the same mistake as Matthias. They had both underestimated the Gerosis mage, Felix. At that time Eren had thought it was just a level 7 mage, and there was no need for schemes and intrigues. He even thought that even if Macklin was right in front of him, he would never fall out with himself because of a low-level mage. So much so that Eren didn't even bother coming up with a scheme when he was in the Nightmare Mountains. He merely tried to charge Felix with hurting his fellow mage and was going to take him to the guild dungeon by force. It never occurred to him that this Felix could have prompted Anduin's help, and from later development, he found that the relationship between the 2 men had gone so deep that it was frightening. It had even gone beyond the scope of apprenticeship. For this reason, Eren had reflected on himself for a long time. Anduin's existence gave Eren a feeling of being tied behind his back. He couldn't deal with Felix directly. Even if he did, he could not let Anduin know that he had something to do with the matter. That day, after returning from the Nightmare Mountains, Anduin had asked Macklin to convey his words to him. "You dare touch a hair on Felix, I'll chop off Bathriller's hand." Eren knew Anduin did have the capability to do so. He dared not provoke Anduin until he had gotten his father's support, so he could only pretend nothing had happened. But that didn't mean that he had forgotten about it. In fact, Eren didn't forget anything, he just hid his thoughts deeper. Eren soon had an idea, because it suddenly occurred to him that the fellow named Felix had not only hurt Bathriller, but also his disciple, Matthias. Matthias was not an ordinary person. If he was willing, he could make big news out of Matthias' status. Forget it. Matthias, if you really want to vent that anger, you should listen to me and follow my arrangements. Don't act on your own imagined cleverness and look for Felix like that. After Eren had finished, he turned and walked out of Matthias' room. He had already devised a complete plan. As long as Matthias didn't act on his own, he'd soon be able to bring that Felix down. There was no need to tell Matthias what the plan was. After all, he was just a chess piece. Chess pieces needed not know too much. The few following days were very peaceful. Lin Li's daily routine was to head straight to the Omniscient Tower once he woke up, and he would only return once it was near dusk. He spent almost 20 days to get from the 1st floor to the 5th. Within these 20 days, he had almost finished reading all of the reading notes from all 5 floors. Being submerged in the sea of knowledge regarding magic, Lin Li did not feel the passage of time. Until this morning. The weather was pleasant, and Lin Li, as before, planned to head for the Omniscient Tower just as he finished his breakfast. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly heard a knock on the door. "Morning, Mr. Macklin." "Morning, getting ready to head out?" The old man did not look well, it seemed as if he did not sleep much. "Yes, I'm planning to head to the Omniscient Tower." "Not bad, very diligent," Macklin nodded, but the words he said gave Lin Li a shock. "However, you don't have to go anymore." "Why?" "Because you have something more important." Lin Li rolled his eyes as he wondered how he did not know. "Members of the Supreme Council are coming." Supreme Council? Macklin's words indeed reminded Lin Li that ever since they came back from the Shadow Glen, Macklin might have mentioned that whoever completed this mission would receive a reward from the Supreme Council. As for the contents of the reward, the old man did not clearly state it, and Lin Li did not question further. In a flash, 20 or more days have passed. Lin Li was at the Omniscient Tower almost every day, and he left the matter in the back of his mind. Unknowingly, this matter was raised up again after such a long time. Could it be that the Supreme Council came over to pay back the debt from back then? I reckon it should be that matter. Looking at his complexion, Macklin knew that this fellow was just thinking about the reward. Thinking about how it would make the Supreme Council bleed, both of them laughed simultaneously. After laughing, Macklin frowned and stared at the robe of wrath that Lin Li was wearing. He then bluntly criticized, "Let me say this, Phallic, can't you change this torn robe? After wearing this torn robe every day, aren't you sick of it? I beg you to do something right and change it immediately. Don't let the Supreme Council think that the Alana's Guild of Magic is torturing you when they see it." "Is it that serious?" Lin Li scratched his head awkwardly. This robe of wrath was indeed slightly ridiculous. Not only was it crumpled and old, it even had a few holes in the sleeves. Luckily, he did not leave the Guild of Magic often, or he might have been mistaken as beggar while walking around Alana City. "It is very serious." The old man affirmatively nodded his head. "Okay, then." Even without Macklin's reminder, Lin Li had long thought of changing the robe of wrath as it was of little value. Ever since he arrived at Anril, he had never filled up the space of over 30 scrolls. The only time the scrolls were ever used was the day that he went with Anduin to the Nightmare Mountains and used air bomb scrolls as geo-explosives. It was just that he had never seen something worth changing into all this while, and he could not bear to lose the magical enchantment for magical resistance. Therefore, this matter has been dragged on since. Unknowingly, it had been dragged on for several months. He could not help it. Currently, the robes seen in the market were always making an issue about scroll space. From 10 to 20 spaces, it mostly cost tens of thousand gold, and rarely would it be a few thousand gold. Wasn't it like having nothing better to do by not using the robe of wrath with 30 scroll space and spending money to buy those that only had 10 or more scroll spaces? Lin Li hesitated, but Macklin seemed like he was prepared for it. He smiled sheepishly and reached out with his right hand that had been behind his back. After that, Lin Li saw that his hand was holding on to a black robe that was folded neatly. Lin Li was astounded. He looked at the black robe and looked at Macklin. He seemed uncertain. This was the robe of the void, magical equipment supplied by the Gilded Rose in limited quantities. Even within Alana's guild, only people of the Archmage rank had the right to wear it. This was something good, and even Macklin was wearing it. Not only did it have space for 15 scrolls, it even had a shield of the void, which could be used once daily. It was equivalent to having another emergency tool during battles. Lin Li was slightly uncertain as this item was not simple. It could fetch more than 500,000 gold if it was sold in the store. Why was Macklin so generous? "Kid, why are you dazed? Hurry, change into it in your room. You helped the guild in the matter with Adventurers Guild, giving you this robe is nothing much," Macklin urged him and placed the black robe into Lin Li's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Macklin." The old man had already said that much. Lin Li did not want to reject him anymore. After taking the black robe, he went into his room. After seeing Lin Li entering his room, Macklin had a slightly pleased smile. This was an idea that he'd painstakingly thought of. He thought of giving the benefits first regardless of whether this kid was interested in coming to Alana. As gifts blinded the eyes, even if the kid were to reject, he would not reject easily after wearing this robe given by the old man. Even though the robe of the void was precious, it was nothing much for the Alana's Guild of Magic. If the robe could rope in a genius like Phallic, it was a deal that could not be any more valuable. If he could, Macklin even wanted to bring a full set of equipment and immediately place a logo of the Alana's Guild of Magic on this kid. At that point, would there be anything left for the fatty Jirian to say? Unfortunately, this kid was too monstrous. His whole body was filled with top-tier equipment, especially that dragon's eye that he took out the other day. It was terrifying. Macklin thought so hard about it that his hair almost turned white. He could only think of using the arrival of the members of the Supreme Council to force this kid to change into a robe. As he was deliberating, Lin Li had already changed into the black robe, and came out from the room before he could even have a breakthrough. Lin Li was not bad looking, and after changing into the new black flames, he seemed to be more refreshed. When he stood at the door, even Macklin was stupefied for a moment. After a brief moment, this old man shamelessly praised, "Not bad, not bad, you're almost like how I looked like when I was younger." Lin Li looked at that old face, and then looked at that goatee. He smartly remained quiet. Macklin wanted to boast more, but the door opened with a gotcha, and then Macklin saw Mason and Oren, each carrying a bag of food entering from the door. Felix, let me tell you, once Mason entered, he started making a fuss. Only when he was halfway through, complaining, did he see Macklin, who was behind the door. Mason immediately swallowed the rest of his words and started smiling. Good morning, Mr. Macklin. Both of you returned at the right time. Come over, I have something to talk to you about. Macklin called both of them over and repeated the same words. Supreme Council? Mason's eyes shined after he heard it. Ever since they returned from the Shadowglen, he had been waiting for the reward from the Supreme Council. He had been waiting for more than 20 days, and the news had finally returned. Instantaneously, he could not be bothered about anything else. He threw his bag of food on the table and started questioning Macklin incessantly. At this time, even Oren, much less Mason, showed some excitement on his face. When is it? Tonight, the council will organize a banquet, and there will be many attendees. You guys just need to be punctual. The old man was annoyed with Mason's barrage of questions. He hurriedly gave them instructions before leaving. Oh, yes. Felix, after seeing Macklin off, Mason thought of the matter at hand earlier. He excitedly said, I heard some news today. What news? Didn't you mention a few days ago that you thought of letting Sean properly learn martial arts? I heard just now that the Auckland Academy is now recruiting new students. Do you want to send Sean over? What is Auckland Academy? Lin Li was slightly confused. After arriving at Alana, he hardly left the Guild of Magic. He had no idea what the Auckland Academy was. Damn, you don't even know what the Auckland Academy is? Mason felt bitter as he could not understand something. Just how was this clueless guy so much more outstanding as compared to himself? After listening to Mason long-windedly talk for a long time, Lin Li could somewhat understand what the Auckland Academy was. It was similar to the Guild of Magic. They were responsible for nurturing talented people. It was just that the Guild of Magic was for nurturing mages, whereas the Auckland Academy was for nurturing warriors. Of course, there were some differences in the smaller details. After all, the warriors were different from mages. This profession did not require much innate talent. As long as you had all 4 limbs, it would be possible to be a qualified warrior. In place such as Felon Kingdom, there were too many people with the possibility of becoming a qualified warrior. This enormous number of apprentices naturally was not the same as the Guild of Magic. It was hard to imagine things such as warriors having a mentor passing down knowledge and a mentor having a few students following him. With the sheer number of students, they would choose academies to enroll in and receive basic training in martial arts. With the Auckland Academy as an example, this academy was known for teaching various martial arts. The students just had to pay a fixed amount in school fees, and they could learn skills from level 1 to level 10. Lin Li was a little excited. Sean had such an unquestionable talent that even a nitpicking old man like Andoin was full of praises for him. He was only lacking proper guidance. If he could enter the Auckland Academy, he would be able to become a formidable warrior within a short period of time. Let me ask what Sean thinks. After Lin said that, he remembered that he did not seem to see Sean today morning when he woke up. He immediately felt uncertain. Oh, yes, did you see Sean today? I didn't see him. Mason's voice was not clear as he was munching on the bread. Nope. Oren shook his head as well. Lin Li was confused. Where did this kid run off to at such an early hour? Do. At this time, there was another series of knocks on the door. May I know whom you are looking for? Lin Li opened the door, and there was a stranger wearing a suit of brown leather armor. From his looks, he was in his 20s. He was fair-skinned and his blonde hair was unusually vibrant. The weirdest part for Lin Li was that this guy looked slightly familiar. Yes. It's you. Before Lin Li could speak, that man had already shouted, and both his eyes were wide open. His face looked like he had just seen a ghost as he pointed at Lin Li. He was stammering, he did not say a word for a very long time. Ah? Lin Li was stupefied at first, but immediately after, his brain was filled with images. Fresh blood was spilled over the base, the four searing hoofs of the shapeshifter, a silver plate filled with holy scent, and the mystical crystal. Wasn't this youngster with a shocked look the guy that brought a group of adventurers to challenge the shapeshifter the other night in the Nightmare Mountains? It appeared that after the battle, he threw a silver plate and almost killed Lin Li. "It's you," Lin Li smiled, and looked like he had suddenly realized it. No. It's not me. It really isn't me." The blonde youngster looked so terrible that it was worse than crying. He did not imagine that things could be so coincidental. Since he returned that night, he was so scared that he could not sleep well. He was afraid that the powerful mage would come searching for him. For the next half a month or so, he was ever so trembling in fear every day. Finally, the situation blew over, and he thought he was safe. He did not think that on his second time going out, he would bump into the victim. It was over. This mage definitely knew who he was. Through the trap laid by that damned boss, he had effortlessly caused himself to walk right into the trap. Why is it so confusing? Lin Li frowned. This guy had some issues, coming over with no rhyme or reason to tell him that it was not him, it really wasn't him. Did he have nothing better to do? Mr. Mage, the blonde youngster, swallowed his saliva, and painstakingly explained himself. The other night, it wasn't intentional. I did not say that it was intentional. Lin Li spoke weakly, and thought, what bullshit, who didn't know you ran away hurriedly? If it was really intentional, I would have killed you. Why bother waiting for you to come to the Guild of Magic? The blonde youngster looked anxious and doubtful. He stared at Lin Li for a while, before deciding that the other party meant what he said. If there is anything else, come in first before we talk about it. Stop looking around, nobody will do anything to you. Oh, the blonde youngster followed Lin Li, and entered the living room, trembling in fear. His complexion unusually nervous, and he looked around uneasily. He did not even know where to place his hands. Please take a seat. Okay. Would you like a drink? Okay. What does your mother do? Okay. Lin Li was about to be driven mad by him. What was wrong with him? Was he just going to say, okay, after coming here early in the morning? Forget it. If there is anything, just hurry up and say it. After you go back, you can slowly say, okay to yourself. Weren't you the one that was looking for me? This time, the blonde youngster did not say, okay. Instead, he had a surprised look on his face. Ah? Lin Li was baffled. When did I ever look for you? You asked Garza to pass the message that you had some business to discuss with me. Oh, after Lin Li heard this, he immediately understood. It appeared that this guy was the one he had been searching for, the one that put up the fire salamandered leather armor for consignment sale. So the owner of the two pieces of equipment was you. You looking for me, was purely for business? After hearing him mentioning the equipment, the blonde youngster finally, somewhat trusted him. It was just that his complexion was still very nervous, and he looked at Lin Li in an anxious and doubtful manner. The scene in Nightmare Mountains had etched a deep impression in him. Of course. Lin Li did not care if he was nervous. He just went straight to the point and asked, was it you that brought that leather armor made from the skin of the fire salamander to the consignment store for sale? Yes, Mr. Mage. Very good. Lin Li nodded his head, and straightforwardly asked, how many pieces left? The question was asked brainlessly. Furthermore, the young blonde was nervous, hence, he was baffled. Ah? How many pieces left? The fire salamander's leather, how many do you have left? I need about 10 pieces. It doesn't matter if I have to pay with money or trade for it. It wouldn't be a problem. The blonde youngster hesitated. You don't have to worry about the price. Lin Li saw him hesitating, and thought that he was worried that Lin Li could not afford it. He did not say much and stated his own price. Let's do this, I will trade with you using potions. For every piece of fire salamandered leather, I will give you 3 bottles of bull's strength potion. 3 bottles? Once this astonishing price was given, the blonde youngster was so scared that he forgot about his nervousness. He could not imagine that this mage was such a big spender. The bull strength potion was something that every physical class dreamed of, especially so a warrior like him. A bottle of bull strength potion could increase one's power by a few levels. In the black market, a bottle of bull strength potion could fetch at least 50,000 gold coins. One piece for 3 bottles, 10 pieces would be 30 bottles. How much money was this? The blonde youngster started to feel that his brain was lacking as he started calculating. Unfortunately, he could only admire this large sum of money. The young blonde hesitated, but he decided to speak the truth. "You're mistaken, Mr. Mage. I'm not worried about the price, I can't deliver the goods." Oh, Lin Li felt regretful, but he was not discouraged. In fact, he had already guessed this answer. The other day, when he helped Sean purchase the leather armor, at least 5 pieces of fire salamandered leather were used. Even if the blonde youngster had an outbreak in his character, he would not be able to deliver that many immediately. "Let's change the terms." Lin Li thought about it, and continued, "Let's exchange 30 bottles of bull strength potion for the location to hunt for fire salamandered." The blonde youth almost went mad at that moment. What does this mage do that he has so many bottles of bull strength potion on hand? He could actually use 30 bottles just for a hunting spot. Unfortunately, he could only admire this large sum of money. If he did not want to just admire it, he could take a risk and fabricate a location. He would think about it later after cheating the 30 bottles of bull strength potion. If he was dealing with somebody else, the blonde youngster might have risked it under the temptation of such a huge sum of money. The problem was that no matter how precious the bull strength potion was, wouldn't he need to be alive to drink it? Was this young mage going to be so easily scammed? "Mr. Mage," the blonde youngster swallowed his saliva with a painful expression. "The leather armor was not ours." "Oh?" "The leather was purchased by me from the black market 1 month ago. Along with the leather armor, there were 2 other items. One was the double-edged greatsword that you bought. The other," after coming to this point, the blonde youngster became somewhat awkward. "The silver plate that smashed me?" Lin Li could guess what was the other item by looking at his complexion. The blonde youth laughed awkwardly. "Yes. Let's leave the silver plate. What I am more concerned about is whether you have a way to help me find the people selling these items. Don't worry, it would not be fruitless for you. Finding them is not an issue, but I need some time. As you know, the black market is a very complicated place. Help me find this person within a month. As for the reward, what do you think about 3 bottles of bull strength potion?" No problem, the blonde youngster nodded his head. Helping to find someone for 3 bottles of bull strength potion, was there any mission in the world that was more worth it? "Oh, yes. What is your name?" "My name is Elijah, Mr. Mage." "Very well, Mr. Elijah. Within a month, this deal would be effective. After you found the person, come look for me at the Guild of Magic. Then, I will give you the 3 bottles of bull strength potion. Of course, it would be even better if you can secure 10 pieces of fire salamandered leather. I will give you 30 bottles of bull strength potion." After sealing the deal, both of them discussed the finer details before Lin Li sent him off. After searching for the fire salamandered leather for almost a month, there was finally some result today. Feeling happy, Lin Li gave himself a day to rest. He would not go to the omniscient tower to read. He would stay at home to organize the knowledge he had learned over this recent period of time. At the same time, he would discuss with Sean about the Auckland Academy when the latter returned. This matter was weird as Sean did not go out usually. However, today was very different. He had left before dawn, and there was no sight of him even until now. Sean did not return, but Macklin came over. When it was approaching the evening, Macklin came over and knocked on the room door. "Hurry, many people came over today. If you guys don't hurry, there will only be leftovers for you." The old man's bawl was more effective than any hypnotism. Mason, who was originally in the room, thinking which robe to wear, had a shock after hearing Macklyn's voice. He hastily wore a black robe, and rushed out of the room like a rabbit. The venue for the banquet was set in the guild hall. When they rushed over, the banquet hall was basked in magnificence and brightly lit with lights. Lin Li looked around. There were 24 training mages, including the 3 of them, as well as some important personnel from the Alana's Guild of Magic. For example, there was Aldwin, Archmage Aaron, who was the son of the president, and Archmage Macklyn, who was beside Lin Li. Within the wide banquet hall, about 50 people were seated. In the hall, there were 2 long tables. Members of the Alana Guild of Magic were at one table, and the other table was for the 24 training mages. Beside Aldwin was an old man, who was 70 years old or more. He looked old, and had a turbid gaze. Both of his eyes were half open as though he had not woken up yet. Even when Aldwin was talking to him, he looked like he lacked enthusiasm. If it was not for the immense, magical wave he was emitting, most people would think that he was just a normal old man. Lin Li looked at him, slightly surprised. This was actually another legendary mage. Did you see that? After Macklyn entered the banquet hall, he hinted Lin Li with his eyes, asking him to look at the old man beside Aldwin. This old man is one of the highest-ranked arbiters. His name is Herza. Don't look at him as though he is almost of the same age as Aldwin. In reality, he is old enough to be Aldwin's grandfather. During these 100 years, he has been handling the external matters of the Supreme Council. As for strength, I only know it is very powerful. How powerful is that? Lin Li was curious. Stronger than me. In any case, Macklyn finished speaking with a depressed look as though he had lost his reputation. Hence, he brazenly added, he might be stronger than Aldwin. That is indeed powerful. The both of them had just exchanged a few words before Macklyn was called over by somebody, leaving Lin Li and the rest looking everywhere curiously. Only when they were almost done looking did the 3 find a few seats to sit down. Lin Li had just sat down, and realized there was somebody familiar sitting beside him. Good evening, Mage Frederick. Good evening, Mage Felix. Frederick felt like slapping himself. Out of all the places to sit, he had to choose this seat. Great, now that this fellow was sitting beside him, he could enjoy tonight's dinner. Thinking about the flaming hands in Shadowglen, Frederick became restless. His butt was rubbing on the seat as though he had piles. Lin Li saw that he looked weird, and concernedly asked, "What's wrong? Is Mage Frederick uncomfortable?" "No. Nothing." "Oh, yes. Why don't I see Kayla and the rest here?" Lin Li chatted with Frederick warm-heartedly. It seemed as though they were good friends that had not met for a long. Just by looking, nobody would have thought that this fellow was the one that used flaming hands without uttering a word in the Shadowglen and almost burnt Frederick. They are with Sarsen. Frederick sat there, feeling as though he was sitting like a soldering iron. He did not dare to change his seat as there would be trouble in case this fella did not give him any face. Oh, Lin Li nodded, and continued making small talk with Frederick. Frederick really felt like smashing his head against the wall. What was this fella thinking by lingering around, having to come up to him when there were so many other people around? Actually, he did not know that Lin Li knew only a few people out of the many in the banquet hall. Since he had already sat there and idling was just idling, why not search for someone familiar to talk to? But, he did not think that his existence gave Frederick so much pressure. Luckily, President Aldwin stood up when Frederick felt like every single second was arduous. "Good evening, everyone." Aldwin's face had a warm smile. His voice was not loud, but it was clear enough for everyone. "The banquet will commence shortly, but before that, I would like to solemnly introduce an important person, one of the arbiters of the Supreme Council, Mage Herza." Clap, 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 clap. There was a loud round of applause in the banquet hall. For most of the mages, the Supreme Council was the most mysterious place with Amril. A mage from the Supreme Council was worthy of their enthusiastic applause. "Good evening, everyone." Herza's voice sounded like he was short of breath. Mage Herza's attendance is mainly for 2 reasons. The first reason is related to the trial at the Shadow Glen. Before the banquet commences, Mage Herza would bestow a gift upon those fellas that were successful during this trial. After this point, Aldwin paused for a moment. The second reason is that Mage Herza will be hosting the finals that will be held in a month's time. The hall was suddenly silent. Aldwin's last sentence had seemingly taken away everybody's attention. Even the leaders of the Alana Guild of Magic held their breaths. Nobody could have imagined that the finals were actually going to be hosted by somebody from the Supreme Council. From these words, many of them could sense something out of the ordinary. The individual guilds were responsible for the previous trials. However, this year, not only did the Supreme Council suddenly organize the mission at the Shadow Glen, they even wanted to host the finals now. Before Aldwin's voice settled, everyone was guessing what was the meaning behind this. Yet, at this point, the insider stood up again. His voice was still weak and faint, but the words he spoke were as though he dropped a bomb in the banquet hall. The victor of the finals will have the support of the Supreme Council to set up a guild in any region. This feeble sentence caused everyone to be excited. Oh my god, thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.